The dungeons beneath the Red Keep are cut from the living rock of Aegon's Hill, and no light reaches them. In the deepest cell, on stone that sweats with groundwater and the memory of 300 years of prisoners, Eddard Stark sits with his back against the wall and his broken legs stretched before him and considers the choices that remain. Above him, a court built on lies prepares to condemn him. Below him, only darkness. But between condemnation and the grave, the law provides one narrow door that neither king nor queen can shut. The right to trial by the judgment of the gods, with 7 champions on each side and the truth decided by steel. It is an ancient right, and it has not been invoked in living memory. And it is about to reshape the 7 kingdoms. The black cells. The cell measured 8 feet by 6, and the ceiling was low enough that a tall man could press his palm flat against it without straightening his arm. There was no window. There was no light. There was a bucket for waste and a second bucket for water that was replaced once a day by a Gowler who never spoke, and the only way Eddard Stark could tell whether it was morning or evening was the temperature of the bread they pushed through the slot. Warm meant breakfast. Cold meant supper. His leg was the worst of it. The bone had been set by Grand Maester Pycelle before the arrest, splintered with ashboards and wrapped in linen, and the initial agony had dulled into a deep, persistent ache that worsened when the damp crept through the stone and settled into his joints. He could bend the knee, but not straighten it fully. He could stand if he braced against the wall, but any weight on the left side sent a bolt of white heat from ankle to hip that stole his breath and blurred his vision. Pycelle had given him milk of the poppy for the pain. The Gowlers had taken it when they took everything else. He did not know how many days he had been underground. 5, at least. Perhaps 7. The darkness eroded time the way water eroded stone, slowly, invisibly, until the surface was smooth and featureless, and all the markers that should have told him where he stood had been worn away. He slept and woke and slept again, and the boundary between the two was unreliable. What he did not lose, even in the dark, was the image of the sword falling in the throne room. Slint's gold cloaks, turning their spears against his household guard. Jory's blood on the marble, but Jory was already dead, killed in the street by Jaime Lannister's men, and the blood in the throne room belonged to Fat Tom and Varley and Cain, and the others whose names the realm would never remember, and whose faces Ned could not stop seeing. He had been stupid. He had warned Cersei. He had told her he knew the truth, that her children were not Robert's, that they were Jaime's, that the crown Joffrey wore belonged by right to Stannis, and he had given her a day to flee. A day. As though honor were a currency that bought time, rather than a target painted on his chest. As though Cersei Lannister would receive a death sentence with gratitude and a head start. Robert would have laughed. Robert would have called him a fool. And he would have been right. And then Robert would have fixed it with violence and bluster and the sheer roaring force that bent the world around him like a storm. But Robert was dead, killed by a boar that Cersei's people had made sure was hunting a drunk rather than a king. And now the boar's work was being finished by the lions. The lock scraped. Ned pressed back against the wall. The door opened, and a lamp entered the cell. A single candle in a tin holder, and behind it a face that seemed to float in the darkness like a pale moon detached from any body. Perfumed, smooth, the face of a man who had learned to exist in the spaces between other people's plans. Lord Stark. Varys set the candle on the floor and lowered himself to sit cross-legged, arranging his robes with the fussy care of a man who had never walked through mud in his life. "You look dreadful. Get out." "I bring wine." He produced a skin from inside his sleeve. "And bread, the real kind, with salt in it, not the grey sponge they give the prisoners." And in exchange, a conversation. Nothing more. Varys unstoppered the wine and held it out. The smell reached Ned, arbor gold, sweet and sharp, and his stomach clenched with a hunger that his pride could not override. He took the skin and drank. "Your daughter Sansa is alive and well," Varys said. "She is kept in the maiden vault under guard. She has not been harmed." The Queen considers her a valuable piece. Ned lowered the wine. The taste turned sour. A piece. A hostage, if you prefer honesty. Which I believe you do, though honesty has not served you well this month. Where is Arya? Gone. Vanished during the fighting. The Lannisters have searched every room in the Red Keep and half the streets in the city. The girl is either dead, hidden, or fled, and my little birds have not yet determined which. I suspect she is alive. Children of wolves are difficult to corner. Ned closed his eyes. The darkness behind his lids was the same as the darkness in the cell, and the relief of that small information, Sansa alive, Arya not found, lasted a single heartbeat before the rest of his situation crowded back in. What does Cersei want? She wants you to confess. Publicly, on the steps of the Great Sept, before the High Septon and the court and the assembled small folk of King's Landing. You will declare that you committed treason, that you plotted to seize the throne, that your accusations against the Queen were lies born of ambition. You will renounce your claim to Winterfell in favor of Robb, who will be permitted to hold the North in the King's name. And you will take the Black and spend the rest of your life at the Wall. And in exchange, you live. Sansa lives. The North is not put to fire and sword. Ned looked at the candle. The flame was small and steady, and the light it cast turned the cell's walls into a geography of shadow and wet stone. She wants me to lie. She wants you to survive. As do I. You want me to declare that Joffrey is Robert's son. Before the gods. In the sight of the Seven. The gods, in my experience, are flexible on matters of survival. My gods are not. He met Varys's eyes. The eunuch's gaze was liquid and dark, unreadable as a pond at night. The children are Jaime's. Every one of them. Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen. Robert has no true-born heir. The throne belongs to Stannis. I am aware of the genealogy, my lord. So is the Queen. The question is not what is true, but what is spoken aloud in front of people who carry swords. And you think the answer is a lie. I think the answer is your daughter's life. Confess, take the Black, and Sansa goes home. Refuse, and Joffrey will have your head, and Sansa remains a hostage until the North breaks or bends. Those are the terms as the Queen has framed them. Ned was silent for a long time. The candle burned. A drop of water fell from the ceiling and struck the stone between them with a sound like a fingernail tapping a drum. No, Varys tilted his head. No, I will not confess to a crime I did not commit. I will not stand before the gods and declare a lie to be truth. Not to save my own life. Not even, his voice caught. He forced it forward. Not even for Sansa. Because if I confess, the lie becomes real. Joffrey's claim is confirmed by the word of the man who challenged it. Stannis is delegitimized. The truth dies, and my daughters live in a kingdom ruled by a lie, and that is not protection. That is a different kind of prison. My lord, your devotion to principle is admirable, but dead men do not protect their daughters at all. I am not going to die on the steps of the Great Sept. I am going to demand a trial. Varys blinked. It was a small motion, but from a man whose face rarely betrayed anything, it registered like a shout. Trial by combat would require you to fight. With that leg, not trial by combat. A trial by 7. The cell went still. Even the flame seemed to pause. A trial by 7, Varys repeated. It is my right. Any man accused of a crime before the faith may demand it. 7 champions on each side, and the gods judge the truth through the outcome. The Andal kings honored it. The Targaryens honored it. Even Aegon IV honored it, and he honored nothing. No king has ever refused, and no High Septon has ever permitted a refusal. It has not been invoked in over a century. Then it is overdue. Varys studied him with an expression that contained, for perhaps the first time in their acquaintance, genuine surprise. You would need 7 men willing to fight for you. 7 men in a city where your household is dead, your allies are fled, and the name Stark is spoken in whispers, if it is spoken at all. Where do you propose to find them? That is not my concern. The law requires that I be given the opportunity to field my champions. The High Septon will enforce it. If the crown refuses, they are defying the gods, and the gods, as you say, carry weight with people who carry swords. And if you cannot find 7, then the gods have already judged me. Varys looked at him for a long while. The candlelight caught the sweat on the eunuch's shaved head and turned it to a crown of small amber beads. You are either very brave, Lord Stark, or very foolish. I have been both, at different times. Varys gathered his robes and stood. He left the bread and the wine on the floor beside the candle, and at the door he paused with his hand on the iron ring. A trial by 7. In this city, against the Kingsguard. He shook his head. I will carry your demand to the High Septon. What happens after that is between you and the gods you trust more than sense. He closed the door. The lock scraped. The candle continued to burn, and Ned sat in its light and ate the bread and drank the wine and felt, beneath the pain in his leg and the fear in his gut, something that he had not felt since the gold cloaks turned their spears against his men. Not hope. Something harder than hope and more dangerous. The conviction that a man who has told the truth should not have to die for it, and that the gods, if they were gods at all, agreed. The Queen's fury. The word reached Cersei in her chambers before breakfast. She was at the dressing table when Pycelle was admitted, the old man shuffling through the doorway with his chain clinking, and his rheumy eyes fixed on the floor, in the manner that signified uncomfortable news. He told her in a voice that trembled with rehearsed concern, and Cersei listened. And when he finished, she picked up the silver hand mirror from the table and threw it at the wall with enough force to crack the glass and chip the stone behind it. He cannot. He does not have the right. He does, Your Grace. The trial by 7 is codified in the laws of the faith. It predates even the conquest. Any man accused of a capital crime before the eyes of the 7 may invoke it. And the High Septon will do as he is told. Pycelle's hands twisted together in front of his chain. The High Septon has already been informed, Your Grace. Lord Varys carried the demand to the Great Sept this morning, and the High Septon has accepted it as valid. Varys. The name came out like venom. Of course. Varys carried it. And the High Septon simply accepted, without consulting the crown. Without, the faith's authority over trials of this nature is independent of the crown, Your Grace. It has been so since the Pact of Faith and Crown under Jaehaerys I. The king, any king, is bound to honor a trial by 7 once invoked. Refusal would constitute defiance of the gods. My son is the king. The gods crowned him, and the gods now wish to judge the man who stands accused before them. These are not contradictory positions, Your Grace. They are merely... Uncomfortable, Cersei dismissed him with a wave that was closer to a slap and sent for Littlefinger. Petyr Baelish arrived within the hour, dressed in a dark doublet embroidered with the mockingbird's sigil he had designed for himself, his face carrying the expression of mild interest that he wore regardless of whether the news was good, bad, or catastrophic. He listened to Cersei's account of the demand with his fingers steepled beneath his chin and his grey-green eyes following her as she paced the length of the room. A trial by 7, he said when she finished. I confess I did not expect that. Lord Stark has surprised me. I am not often surprised. I am not interested in your admiration of the man. I want to know how to stop it. You can't. Not directly. The High Septon has confirmed the right, and 300 years of legal precedent supports him. If Joffrey refuses the trial, the faith will declare it an act of impiety. The small folk will riot, and the Tyrells, whose support you will eventually need, will note that the crown considers itself above the gods. None of those outcomes serve you. Then, we ensure we win. Obviously, the question is how, and the answer is champions. Littlefinger spread his hands. You need 7 men willing to fight in the king's name. Stark needs 7 willing to die for his. The advantage is entirely yours. You have the Kingsguard. He has nothing. Then, it should be simple. It should be. But Ned Stark has a talent for attracting men who believe in him, and belief makes men dangerous. Cersei stopped pacing. She stood by the window, looking out over the black water. The morning sun turned the water to hammered gold, and the ships at anchor threw long shadows across the surface. We put our strongest fighters on the field and end it in minutes. The Hound, Meryn Trant, Mandon Moore, Greenfield, Oakheart, put Ilan Payne in white armor and give him a sword. The man is a butcher, and the sight of him will empty the courage from whoever Stark manages to find. Sir Boros Blount for the 7th? Blount is a craven. Blount is alive and available and wears a white cloak. Cravens survive, Your Grace. There is a pragmatic argument for including one man on the field whose primary commitment is to still breathing when it's over. Cersei's lip curled. Fine, Blount, 7 then, and who does Stark have? His household is dead. His friends are gone. His brother is calling banners in the north, but his brother is a boy of 15 and won't reach King's Landing before the trial. His brother will hear about this by Raven within 2 days and will factor it into his campaign. But you're right. The immediate question is whether Stark can field 7 champions at all. If he cannot, the trial defaults. The gods have judged him guilty by the absence of anyone willing to fight for his cause. Can we ensure he cannot find them? Littlefinger smiled. It was a small, precise expression, the kind that concealed more than it revealed. We can make it very difficult. Any man who volunteers to fight against the crown risks his life, his lands, and his family's future. The financial disincentives alone should thin the field. As for anyone foolish enough to volunteer regardless, well, men can be discouraged. Do it. I should mention one complication. Littlefinger's smile did not waver. Sir Barristan Selmy. Cersei went rigid. She had not thought of Barristan. She had put Barristan out of her mind the day Joffrey dismissed him, because Barristan was old and humiliated and no longer relevant. But Barristan was in King's Landing. Barristan had no love for the Lannisters, and Barristan, despite his years, remained one of the most dangerous swordsmen in the 7 Kingdoms. He would not dare. He might. He was dismissed from the order he served for his entire adult life, stripped of his rank by a boy he does not respect, and told his service was no longer required. If Lord Varys, or anyone else, were to approach him and suggest that the gods need a champion, Selmy's sense of honor would do the rest. Then prevent it. Buy him. Threaten him. Arrest him. Arresting a former Lord Commander of the Kingsguard on the eve of a trial by 7 would be noticed. It would suggest that the Crown fears the outcome. The Crown does not fear. Of course not. But the appearance of fear is sometimes more damaging than fear itself. Cersei stared at him. Littlefinger held her gaze with the serene confidence of a man who always had 3 plans prepared and was merely choosing which to implement. Find out what Selmy intends, she said. And if he intends to fight, stop him. I don't care how. As you say, Your Grace. The small council met at midday in the chamber overlooking the Blackwater. The session was brief and brutal. Joffrey attended, which was unusual. He sat at the head of the table in his black and gold doublet with the crown on his head and the expression of a boy who had been given a toy and then told he could not break it. I want him dead, Joffrey said. He's a traitor. He tried to steal my throne. He should be dead already. Your Grace, the trial by 7, Pycelle began. I don't care about the trial. Cut his head off. I'm the king. Your Grace, Cersei said, and her voice had the polished smoothness that she used when managing her son, which was to say managing a fire that could ignite in any direction. Lord Stark has invoked an ancient right. The High Septon has accepted it. If we deny the trial, the faith will turn against us, and the faith controls the small folk. And the small folk are the difference between a city that obeys and a city that burns. Then, let it burn. I have the gold cloaks. The gold cloaks were bought by your grandfather's gold. Gold runs out. Faith does not. She placed her hand over his on the table. We will win this trial. Our champions are the finest fighters in the realm. Stark will bring hedge knights and cripples to the field, and the Hound will cut through them before noon. When it is over, the gods themselves will have confirmed your right to the throne. That is worth more than a headsman's sword. Joffrey considered this. He was 13 and preferred the direct approach, which meant violence. But the prospect of the gods endorsing his kingship in front of the entire city appealed to the part of him that craved spectacle and validation. Fine, but if he somehow wins, I want him dead anyway. He won't win, Cersei said. Littlefinger caught Varys's eye across the table. The spider sat with his hands folded, his expression arranged into the perfect neutrality of a man who was already 5 moves ahead and was watching the other players catch up. Littlefinger raised an eyebrow. Varys returned a look that communicated nothing and everything simultaneously. The look of a man who had set a piece in motion and was content to let gravity do the work. The date was set. The trial by 7 would take place in a fortnight, in the yard before the Great Sept of Baelor, with the High Septon presiding, and the city bearing witness. Both sides were given 10 days to assemble their champions. On the 11th day, the names would be formally presented. On the 14th day, the steel would speak. The ravens went out that afternoon. 1 to Casterly Rock, 1 to River Run, 1 to the Eyrie, 1 to Storm's End, 1 to Dragonstone, and 1, unsigned and unsealed, to an inn on the Street of Steel, where an old knight in borrowed clothes was drinking ale and staring at the sword on the table in front of him, and wondering whether the gods had any use left for a man the world had already discarded. The search for champions. The formal crier read the announcement in 3 squares: the market square before the Dragon Pit, the fishmonger's plaza near the Mudgate, and the steps of the Great Sept itself. The crier was a thin man with a voice like a cracked bell, and the words he spoke had been composed by the High Septon's clerks and carried the weight of 3 centuries of precedent. Be it known that Lord Eddard Stark, accused of treason against his Grace King Joffrey of houses Baratheon and Lannister, first of his name, has invoked his sacred right to a trial by 7, as provided by the laws of the faith and the customs of the realm. The accused is entitled to name 7 champions to fight in his cause. Any knight, lord, or man of arms who wishes to champion the accused may present himself to the Septon of the Great Sept before the 10th day. The crown will name its own 7. The trial will be held on the 14th day hence, in the yard before the Great Sept. May the Father above judge justly, and may the warrior lend his strength to the righteous. The announcement landed in the city like a stone dropped into a well. For a day, nothing happened. The ripples spread outward in silence, through taverns and markets and dockside alehouses, carried by the informal machinery of gossip that moved faster than ravens and required no sealing wax. Then the reaction came, and it came from every direction at once. The small folk talked. They had opinions about Ned Stark. Some remembered that he had opened the granaries during his brief tenure as Hand, that he had walked the streets without a guard, that his justice had been even-handed. Others remembered only that he had been arrested for treason, and that treason meant death. The trial by 7 divided the city the way a river divides a valley. People on both banks shouted at each other across the water, and the water itself carried nothing but noise. Inside the Red Keep, the scramble for Ned's champions began in silence. Varys moved first. He went to the inn on the Street of Steel on the evening of the 2nd day, dressed in the rough brown cloak of a merchant and carrying a walking stick he did not need. The inn was called the Anvil, and it served ironworkers and armourers and the apprentices who swept their floors, and the clientele were the kind of men who noticed weapons and calluses and did not notice faces, which was precisely why the inn had been chosen. Barristan Selmy sat in the back corner with a cup of ale and a plate of salt beef he had not touched. He wore no armour. His clothes were common, a faded jerkin, leather breeches, a traveller's cloak with the hood down. He was 63 years old, his hair was white, and his face had the weathered quality of a coastline shaped by decades of wind and spray. His hands were still steady. His eyes were still the eyes that had watched 17-year-old Maelys Blackfire die at his feet on the stepstones and had not flinched. He looked up when Varys sat down across from him. He did not seem surprised. Lord Varys. Sir Barristan, you don't look like a man who is planning to leave the city. I haven't decided what I'm planning. Varys ordered ale he would not drink. You heard the crier. The whole city heard the crier. And? Barristan rotated the cup between his palms. The motion was slow and measured, and it continued for long enough that Varys began to wonder whether the old knight had decided to let the silence answer for him. When I was dismissed, Barristan said, the boy told me I was too old. He told me my service was no longer required. He had his mother's hand on his shoulder while he said it, and the words were hers, but the cruelty was his own. I drew my sword and threw it at their feet and told them to melt it down and add it to the throne, and then I walked out of the hall. Do you know what I felt? Fury, I should imagine. Relief. The word landed with the weight of a confession. Relief. Because I had spent 2 years watching Joffrey pull wings off flies and kick servants and torment his brother, and I knew, I had known since the day Robert died, that the boy on the throne was not Robert's son. Not in temperament, not in face, not in anything that mattered. And I had done nothing. I had stood in my white cloak and held my tongue, and done nothing, because the Kingsguard serves the king, and the king was the king, and the oath did not have a clause for when the king was a monster's bastard. He looked at Varys. The eyes were pale blue, faded by decades but not dimmed. You want me to fight for Stark? I want you to consider whether the gods deserve a fair trial. 7 men on each side, that is the law. If the crown fields the Kingsguard, and the accused fields farmers and stable boys, the trial is not a judgment. It is a butchery with a septon's blessing. The gods cannot speak through steel if the steel is only on one side. The gods can do as they like. They don't need my help. Perhaps, but Eddard Stark does. Barristan looked at his untouched plate. He thought about Robert, the real Robert, the young Robert who had swung his warhammer at the trident with a fury that reshook the world. He thought about Jon Arryn, dead of a poison that smelled like natural causes and tasted like Lannister gold. He thought about the white cloak they had taken from him, and the years it represented, and the oaths he had sworn and broken and bent and kept. And whether the keeping or the bending mattered more at the end. If I fight for Stark, he said, I fight against the crown I served, against the Kingsguard I commanded, against boys I trained. You fight against a lie, Varys said, which, if I recall, is the thing you swore to do when you first put on the white. Barristan drained his ale. He set the cup down on the table and stared at it as though it contained an answer he was not sure he wanted. I'll think about it. Think quickly. Time is not generous. Varys left the inn and dissolved into the street the way smoke dissolves into fog. Barristan remained at his table, and the barmaid who came to refill his cup found a man whose face held the expression of someone performing a calculation, whose answer he already knew and was trying to find a different one. He could not find a different one. 2 days later, Sir Barristan Selmy presented himself at the Great Sept of Baelor and informed the Septon on duty that he wished to champion the accused. The news reached Cersei within the hour. She broke a wine goblet and 3 candles and the arm of a chair before Littlefinger talked her down to something approaching coherent fury. I told you to stop him. I attempted to. He was approached by 3 separate agents, each offering gold, a position, safe passage to Essos. He refused them all. The man has decided that honor requires his participation, and honor, in my experience, is immune to commerce. Then, arrest him. On what charge? He holds no office. He commands no troops. He has committed no crime. Arresting a knight for volunteering to fight in a trial sanctioned by the faith will make the crown look afraid. Worse, it will make the crown look guilty. We are not guilty. Littlefinger said nothing. The silence communicated more than any word could have, and Cersei's jaw went tight with the effort of not breaking something else. Who else? She asked. Who else has volunteered for the traitor? As of this morning, 2. Selmy and a Stark guardsman named Alyn, who survived the purge by being at the harbour when the gold cloaks moved. He went to ground in Flea Bottom and surfaced at the Sept yesterday. He is young and unremarkable. The danger is Selmy. 2. He needs 7. Where will he find the other 5? I am working to ensure he does not. But the gods, or fortune, or the sheer stubborn gravity of a cause that men believed in, continued to deliver champions to the Great Sept. The third came on the fourth day. Sir Robar Royce, second son of Bronze Jon Royce, Lord of Runestone, walked into the Sept in the polished bronze and iron armor of the first men tradition, and knelt before the altar of the warrior and declared his intention to fight for the accused. He was 24, dark-haired, with the broad shoulders and long arms of a man bred for war in the mountains of the Vale. His father had competed against the Lannisters in tournaments for 20 years and lost to them only twice, and the Royce name carried the weight of an ancient house that had ruled the Vale before the Arryns came with their Andal swords and their 7-pointed stars. Robar's reasons were his own. He had been in King's Landing for the tournament season and had stayed for court. And when the announcement was made, he had spent 2 days walking the city walls in the pre-dawn darkness, arguing with himself. His father would not approve. His father would say that a Royce did not throw his life away on a Stark's quarrel in a city 1,000 miles from home. His father would be right. But Jon Arryn had fostered Ned Stark. Jon Arryn had been Bronze Jon's liege lord and his friend. And Jon Arryn was dead, poisoned, Robar believed, by the same people who now accused Ned Stark of treason. The connection was not proof. It was instinct, and instinct was what the first men had trusted before the Andals arrived with their scrolls and their precedents and their talent for making injustice look legal. I fight for Lord Stark, he told the Septon, and for the Vale's honor. The fourth champion arrived the next day, and he was nothing like the third. Sir Glendon Flowers was a bastard of the Reach, born to a tavern woman in Tumbleton, knighted by a hedge knight he had squired for, and possessed of no reputation worth naming, no lands, no income, and no horse that did not belong to someone else. He was 28, lean, sandy-haired, with a scar across his chin from a tournament melee in the Reach that he had entered under a borrowed name and lost in the second round. He had come to King's Landing looking for employment and had found instead a crier in the marketplace reading the call for champions. His reasons were simpler than Robar Royce's and less noble. He had nothing. No house, no name that anyone honored, no future beyond the next meal he could earn by his sword. But a man who fought in a trial by 7, win or lose, live or die, would be remembered. Songs were written about the champions at Ashford. History kept their names when it discarded the names of lords and ladies and kings. Glendon Flowers wanted his name kept. He told the Septon this, with a bluntness that amused some and disturbed others. I'm not fighting for Stark's honor, he said. I don't know the man. I'm fighting because this is the only chance I'll ever have to be worth remembering. The Septon accepted him without comment. The gods did not require noble motives, only willing steel. The fifth champion took longer. Sir Marlon Manderley was a cousin of Lord Wyman Manderley of White Harbour, a younger son of a younger son, sent south to negotiate timber contracts with the merchants of the Blackwater. He had arrived in King's Landing a month before Robert's death, and had remained because the political upheaval had frozen all commerce, and his ship would not return until the tides turned, which they showed no sign of doing. He was 36, thick-bodied, with the Manderley features, heavy jaw, blue eyes, fair hair running to grey at the temples. He was not a brilliant swordsman. He had fought in 2 border skirmishes against wildling raiders along the eastern coast of the north and acquitted himself without distinction or disgrace. He carried a longsword that had belonged to his grandfather and wore mail rather than plate, because plate was expensive and younger sons of younger sons did not have the luxury of expense. He heard the crier and spent 3 days pretending he had not heard. He visited the Sept twice, circling the building without entering, and on the second visit he stood in the yard where the trial would be held, and looked at the ground where men would bleed and tried to imagine his own blood among it. On the 6th day he walked in and gave his name. Why? The Septon asked. Because I'm a Manderley, and the Manderleys owe the Starks a debt that goes back 1,000 years. Because Lord Eddard is our liege lord's liege lord, and no one else from the north is here. And because my wife would never forgive me if I sailed home and told her I watched and did nothing. The Septon wrote his name in the ledger. Marlon Manderley left the Sept and went back to his inn and drank an entire bottle of Dornish Red and did not sleep. 5 champions. 2 more needed. And the days were running out. The 6th arrived on the 8th day, and his arrival caused the kind of disturbance that occurs when a man of the cloth picks up a sword. Brother Clement was a begging brother of the faith, a wandering mendicant, who lived on alms and travelled the roads between the Sept of Baelor and the septries of the Riverlands, ministering to the small folk and sleeping in barns and hedgerows. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with the rough hands of a man who had done manual labour before taking his vows. He had been a blacksmith's son in Lannisport before a fever killed his wife and both daughters and sent him searching for the gods in the bottom of a despair so deep it had no echo. He carried a mace. Not a ceremonial mace, a war mace, iron-headed, dented from use, strapped to his back alongside the 7-pointed star that hung from a leather cord around his neck. He had never explained the mace to the other brothers. They assumed it was for protection on the road. The truth was that Brother Clement had been a soldier before he was a smith, and a smith before he was a brother, and the mace was the only possession from his previous life that he had not been able to give away. He heard the call for champions on the steps of the Sept itself, where he had been begging for bread, and he stood up and walked inside and told the Septon that the gods had spoken to him. "Spoken to you," the Septon repeated. "Through the trial." The trial by 7 is the god's own instrument. If the accused is innocent, the gods will prove it through the steel of his champions. But the gods cannot prove anything through the steel of men who do not believe. You need a man who believes. I am that man. You are a begging brother, not a knight. The law says any knight, lord, or man of arms. I am a man of arms. I have killed 7 men in my life and prayed for each of them after. The gods know my hand and my heart, and if they judge that I am insufficient to their purpose, they will let me fall. But I will not let them down by refusing to stand. The Septon looked at the mace. He looked at Brother Clement's hands, scarred, thick-knuckled, steady. He looked at the 7-pointed star around the man's neck. Your name will be entered. 6 champions. 1 more needed. And the time was almost gone. The 10th day arrived. By the laws of the trial, the names of all champions had to be presented to the High Septon before sunset. The crown had submitted its 7 on the 6th day. Sandor Clegane, Sir Meryn Trant, Sir Mandan Moore, Sir Preston Greenfield, Sir Eris Oakhart, Sir Boros Blount, and Sir Ilyn Payne. The names were read aloud in the Sept, and the crowd that had gathered to hear them went silent at the list, because the names represented the most dangerous collection of fighters the crown could assemble without reaching beyond the city walls. Ned Stark had 6. Barristan Selmy, Alan, Sir Robar Royce, Sir Glendon Flowers, Sir Marlon Manderley, Brother Clement, 6 men, a dismissed Lord Commander, a young guard, a Vale Knight, a bastard hedge knight, a northern trader, and a begging brother with a mace, against the Kingsguard and the Hound and the King's Justice, and no 7th. In the cells beneath the Red Keep, Ned received the news from the Septon who had been assigned as his spiritual advisor, a nervous young man named Septon Barreld who trembled when he spoke and who had clearly been chosen for the role because his superiors considered him expendable. 6 champions, my lord. The High Septon has granted an extension until dawn. If a 7th has not been named by sunrise, the trial will be declared forfeit. Ned sat against the wall. His leg throbbed. The splint had been replaced 2 days ago by a maester whose hands shook either from age or from fear, and the fresh binding was tighter than the old one, and pressed against the bone in a way that produced a constant low-grade agony he had learned to file beneath more pressing concerns. "Who are they?" he asked. "My champions. Tell me their names." The Septon read them from a piece of parchment. Ned recognized Barristan's name and Alan's. The others were strangers. 6 men I have never met are willing to die for me, he said, and I cannot even stand to meet them. My lord, if a 7th, I am the 7th. The Septon stared at him. My lord, your leg. My leg is broken, not gone. I can hold a sword. I can stand. If I fall, I fall, and the gods will judge that as they see fit. But I will not sit in a cell while 6 men fight and bleed and die for a truth I swore to defend. Enter my name. My lord, the High Septon will need to approve. The law permits the accused to fight among his own champions. Check the precedent. Duncan the Tall fought in his own trial by 7 at Ashford, and he was the accused. The law is clear. Enter my name. Septon Barrowed looked at the piece of parchment in his hands, and then at the man sitting on the floor of a dungeon cell with a broken leg, and the calm, inflexible expression of a northern lord who had made his decision and did not intend to revisit it. I will inform the High Septon, he said. He left the cell. Ned leaned his head back against the stone and closed his eyes. 7. Barristan Selmy, the greatest living knight, who had served 5 kings and been discarded by the 6th. Alan, 20 years old, who had watched his friends die in the throne room and survived by accident. Robar Royce, who fought for a debt his father's liege lord had carried. Glendon Flowers, who fought for a name. Marlon Manderley, who fought because he could not go home and tell his wife he hadn't. Brother Clement, who fought because the gods told him to. And Ned Stark, who fought because the truth should not require other men's blood and nothing else. He was under no illusions. He had seen the crown's list. The Hound alone was worth 2 of his champions, and Mandan Moore was a killer whose face showed nothing and whose sword showed no mercy. Meryn Trant was mediocre but brutal. Ilyn Payne was a nightmare in steel, tongueless, pitiless. The king's own executioner with a greatsword and the dead eyes of a man who had long since stopped counting the heads he'd taken. His 7 were outmatched. He knew it. They would know it. And still they had come. The gods would judge. The steel would speak. And Ned Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, would stand among his champions on a broken leg and let the gods do with him as they would. Outside the cell, the sun was setting over King's Landing, and the city was holding its breath. The Raven reached Winterfell on the 3rd day after Ned's demand was made public. Maester Luwin brought the message to Robb in the Great Hall, where the young Lord of Winterfell was seated at the long table with a map of the North spread before him, and the weight of 30,000 men's loyalty pressing on shoulders that were not yet wide enough to carry it. He was 15. His jaw was set in the expression that men 3 times his age wore when they were trying to look confident, and the effort showed. Theon Greyjoy stood at his right, arms crossed, radiating the casual contempt of a ward who had spent his life observing the Stark household and was now watching it mobilize with the detached interest of a man whose loyalty was a loan, not a gift. Robb read the message twice. He read it a 3rd time. Then he set it on the table and placed both palms flat on either side of it, and stood that way, pressing down, as though he could force an answer from the wood. A trial by 7, he said. My lord? Theon leaned forward. My father has demanded a trial by 7. The hall went still. The northern lords who had gathered at Winterfell for the march south, Great Jon Umber, Rickard Karstark, Galbart Glover, Mage Mormont, the others, turned from their conversations and their cups and their private calculations about supply lines and fodder. The phrase trial by 7 carried a weight that even men who had never heard it spoken in their lifetimes recognized from the songs and histories. When? Greatjon asked. His voice was like the rumble of a rockfall. Deep, carrying, impossible to ignore. A fortnight from the writing. By the time this reaches us, Robb looked at Luwin. The trial will be in 10 days, my lord. Perhaps 11. 10 days. Robb looked at the map. Winterfell was 1,000 miles from King's Landing. Even at a forced march, even cutting through the neck and driving south day and night, his army could not reach the capital in less than a month. We can't get there. No, Luwin said. But Lord Stark's demand changes the situation. He is alive. He will be alive for at least 10 more days. And if the gods judge in his favor, my father walks free. Robb's voice cracked on the word father, a fracture that he covered by turning to the window, where the autumn light was coming through in long bars of gold. He was 15, and his father was in a dungeon, and the world was expecting him to be a lord. and the crack was the sound of the boy inside the Lord, trying not to break through. "He needs champions," Karstark said. The Lord of Carhold was a hard man, long-faced, grey-bearded, with the lean muscle of a soldier who had spent 50 years swinging a sword and had no intention of stopping. 7 men willing to fight for him. In King's Landing. "Where do we send?" "We can't send anyone." Robb turned from the window. 10 days. The neck alone takes 6 by the fastest rider, and then the Riverlands, and then the Crownlands. No one from Winterfell reaches King's Landing in time. "A raven to someone already in the south," Luwin suggested. "To who? Our household is dead." "My mother is." Robb stopped. He looked at Luwin with the sudden focus of a man who has just remembered a piece he had left off the board. "Where is my mother?" The last word was from the eerie my lord. But that was before the arrest. If Lady Catelyn left the Eyrie after, she would ride for Riverrun. She would ride for her father. Robb moved to the map. His finger traced the route. The Eyrie to the high road, through the mountains of the moon, down to the Riverlands. If she reached Riverrun, and if a raven reaches Riverrun, a raven from Winterfell to Riverrun, 2 days. Perhaps 3. Send one. Now, tell my mother about the trial. Tell her. He hesitated. What to tell her? Send fighters? There were no Stark fighters south of the Neck. Catelyn was a woman who had been raised to rule a household and navigate politics, not to recruit champions in a war zone. But Catelyn was not alone. If she had reached Riverrun, she was with her father, Hoster Tully, Lord of Riverrun, who commanded the Riverlords and their armies. And she was with her uncle, Brynden Tully, the Blackfish. Tell my mother that my father needs champions, anyone she can send. And tell her, he pressed his hand against the map, tell her I'm coming south regardless. Whether he wins the trial or not, I'm coming south. The Grietjon slammed his fist on the table. Aye, hell's with waiting. We march, my lord. Luwin cautioned, the crossing at the Twins will require Lord Frey's permission, and Lord Frey will require payment. I know. Everyone in the north knows. Walder Frey opens his gates for a price, and the price goes up when you need him most. Robb looked at the map again. The Twins sat across the Green Fork like a gate with a toll, and every road south that didn't go through the swamps of the Neck went through Walder Frey's bridge. What do we offer him? Theon asked. Whatever he asks. My father's life is worth more than whatever Walder Frey can imagine. Lord Frey can imagine quite a lot, Luwin said. Then we'll pay quite a lot. Send the ravens. 1 to Riverrun, 1 to the Twins, 1 to White Harbour, in case Lord Manderley has men who can sail south faster than we can march. Move. The ravens went out within the hour. Robb stood on the battlements of Winterfell and watched them go, small dark shapes against the grey sky, carrying the weight of a house and a father and a war that had not yet begun but was already building like a thunderhead on the southern horizon. Below him, in the yard, the northern army was assembling. 12,000 men when the full muster arrived. Umber, Karstark, Mormont, Glover, Bolton, Hornwood, Serwyn, Dustin, Tallheart, and the rest. Infantry and cavalry and supply wagons and the carts that carried the tents and the grain and the things that armies needed to survive long enough to fight. The sound of hammers on steel rose from the smithy. The sound of hooves on stone rose from the stables. The sound of 15,000 conversations, each one carrying the low vibration of men preparing for the possibility of death, rose from everywhere. Robb watched and listened, and felt the scale of it settle onto him like armor, heavy, necessary, and sized for a man larger than himself. In Riverrun, 4 days later, a raven arrived. Catelyn Stark read the message in her father's solar, sitting beside the bed where Hoster Tully lay ill, the old lord weakened by the same sickness that had been slowly consuming him for 2 years, his face gaunt beneath the Tully red hair gone white, his breath a rasp that filled the room with the sound of dying even when the man himself refused to do it. She read it twice. Her hands shook. She put the parchment down on the side table and pressed her fingers against her eyelids and drew a breath that was meant to be steadying and was not. Trial by 7. Her voice was thin enough to cut. Brynden Tully stood by the window. The Blackfish was 56, lean as a whip, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from iron and left out in the weather. He had ridden from the Eyrie with Catelyn and had arrived at Riverrun 3 days before the Raven, and in those 3 days he had reorganized the castle's defences, inspected the garrison, and terrified 2 of Edmure's squires into competence. Because the Blackfish was a man who could not sit idle, and whose solution to anxiety was to make everyone around him more anxious. When? He asked. 10 days from the writing. The Raven took 4. That leaves 6. 6 days. Brynden looked at the map on the wall. Riverrun to King's Landing. Through the Riverlands, friendly territory, if the Lannisters hadn't burned it yet. Down the Gold Road or the King's Road. At a hard ride, a single rider could cover the distance in 8 days, maybe 7 if the horse was good and the rider was willing to kill it. I can't make it in time, he said. Uncle, 6 days. I need at least 7. And that's if I ride day and night and destroy 3 horses doing it. Then someone closer. Someone already in the Crownlands, or the Stormlands, or Cat. He turned from the window. His face held the expression she remembered from childhood, the look he wore when he was about to do something her father would disapprove of. I said I can't make it in time. I didn't say I won't try. Brynden, if you ride and arrive too late, if I ride and arrive too late, I'm a fool on a dead horse outside the gates of a city that wants my family destroyed. If I ride and arrive in time, I'm the 7th champion of Eddard Stark, and the songs will remember me for something other than arguing with your father about whether I should have married. He was already moving toward the door. Catelyn stood and caught his arm, a gesture that meant wait, and also meant be careful, and also meant please don't die for my husband the way other men are already dying. Ride fast, she said. I always ride fast. It's the stopping I'm bad at. He kissed her forehead, took the stairs 2 at a time, and was in the yard calling for his best horse before she reached the window. She watched him ride out through the Watergate, a single rider on a bay courser. Riding south at a pace that was already faster than sense allowed, and she stood at the window until he disappeared into the trees along the Red Fork, and the dust of his passing settled, and the only sound was her father's breathing, and her own. The Lion and the Stag. Tywin Lannister received the news at his field headquarters on the south bank of the Green Fork, where his army was encamped while Jaime's forces operated independently in the Riverlands. He read the message from Cersei with the same expression he read supply reports, flat, analytical, devoid of any visible reaction. He read it a second time, folded it, and set it on the table beside his maps. Trial by 7, he said to Kevan, who stood across the table with the wary attention of a younger brother who had learned that Tywin's quietest moments were his most dangerous. An archaic rite. Rarely invoked. Rarely invoked because most men accused of treason prefer the simplicity of confession or execution to the spectacle of dying in front of the entire capital. Stark is not most men. Tywin's fingers drummed the table, a single staccato burst, then stillness. He is trying to buy time. For Robb to march south? For Robb? For Stannis? For anyone with a sword and a grievance? The trial delays his execution by a fortnight in which the Stark boy gathers his forces and crosses the neck and enters the Riverlands, where my son is currently operating with a force that is adequate but not overwhelming. Can the trial be stopped? Not without defying the faith. Cersei will have attempted it and failed. The High Septon is a weak man, but a stubborn one, and the law is clear. Tywin looked at the map. The Green Fork. The Trident. The King's Road running south. The chessboard of rivers and castles and armies that he had spent a lifetime learning to read. The trial cannot be stopped, therefore it must be won. And won decisively. Not a close victory that invites dispute, but a demonstration so absolute that every lord in the 7 kingdoms understands the cost of opposing the crown. The Kingsguard should be sufficient. The Kingsguard is mediocre. Trant is a bully. Blount is a coward. Greenfield is competent, but nothing more. The only men on the crown's roster worth their steel are the Hound and Mandan Moor, and Moor is dangerous but limited. He lacks the ability to inspire fear beyond arm's reach. He paused. Cersei has selected well given her options. I would have chosen differently. And Stark's champions? Selmy is the concern. Barristan Selmy is 63 years old and the finest swordsman of his generation. If Cersei had not dismissed him on a 13-year-old's whim, he would be fighting for us. Instead, he fights for the man we accused. Can he be removed? Not without consequences that outweigh the benefit. If Selmy dies before the trial, by poison, by accident, by any means that can be attributed to the crown, the realm will conclude that we murdered an old knight to prevent the gods from judging us. That conclusion would cost us more than a lost trial. Tywin stood. He walked to the tent's entrance and looked out at the army encamped across the riverbank, 20,000 men under the lion banner, their fires burning in rows that stretched to the tree line. The efficiency of the camp pleased him. The order pleased him. What did not please him was the growing awareness that his family's grip on the Iron Throne was being contested not just by armies, but by an old man's sense of justice and a crippled lord's refusal to lie. Write to Cersei. Tell her to win the trial. Tell her to instruct the Hound to kill Selmy first, whatever it takes, however many men it costs. Selmy must fall before he can turn the tide. The rest of Stark's champions are negligible. Remove Selmy and the trial ends in minutes. He returned to his maps. Kevin drafted the letter. The Raven went south at dawn. On Dragonstone, the news arrived by way of a fishing boat rather than a Raven, one of the small craft that made the crossing between the island and the mainland, carrying trade goods and gossip and the shifting mix of reliable and unreliable information that constituted the intelligence network of Stannis Baratheon. Stannis read the report in his study, a bare room of stone and salt air, furnished with a table, a chair, and a rack of maps, and nothing else. No tapestries, no carpets, no ornaments. Stannis did not believe in ornament. He believed in facts, and the fact before him was that Eddard Stark, the only lord in the Seven Kingdoms who had independently confirmed the illegitimacy of Cersei's children, had demanded a trial that would keep him alive long enough for the truth to gain purchase. He is either very brave or very stupid, Stannis said. His jaw worked, a grinding motion that had become habitual during the years of silence on Dragonstone, when he had known the truth about Cersei and had told no one except Jon Arryn, and Jon Arryn had died, and the truth had been buried with him. Ned Stark is brave, Davos Seaworth said. The Onion Knight stood at the door with his maimed hand, 4 fingertips shortened by Stannis' justice, a punishment for the smuggling that had fed Storm's End during the siege, resting on the belt where his fingerbones used to hang. He would not demand a trial he did not believe the gods would judge rightly. The gods do not judge. Men with swords judge. The gods are what men call the outcome when they do not wish to take responsibility for it. Stannis ground his jaw. If Stark wins, he goes free. If he goes free, he goes north. And if he goes north, the truth goes with him. The truth about Cersei, about Joffrey, about the succession. Every lord in the Seven Kingdoms will have to choose between a Lannister bastard on the throne and the lawful claim of the rightful heir. Which is you? Which is me? Stannis said it without pride or pleasure. The crown was his by right, Robert's throne, passed to the eldest true-born brother in the absence of legitimate children. He did not want it. He had never wanted it. But it was his, and Stannis Baratheon did not relinquish what was his. We should send a declaration, Davos said. Now, while the trial is pending. Tell the realm the truth about Cersei, about the children, about Joffrey. No, my lord. If I declare before the trial, I am a claimant making an accusation. If I declare after the trial, after the gods have judged Stark innocent, I am a lawful heir confirming what divine judgment has already revealed. The timing matters. Timing is the difference between a rebel and a king. Davos considered this. He was a smuggler's son and a knight by unlikely promotion, and the political calculus of royal claims was not his natural terrain. But he had spent enough years with Stannis to understand that the man's rigidity was itself a kind of strategy, Stannis did things in the right order because doing them in the wrong order offended him, and offense, in Stannis, produced a stubbornness that no army could breach. And if Stark loses, the gods have confirmed Joffrey's right, and my claim becomes harder to press. Not impossible. Trial by combat proves nothing except who has the better sword, but harder. The lords will see the divine judgment and hesitate. Then we should pray for Stark's victory. I don't pray. I prepare. Stannis turned to the window. The Blackwater Bay stretched before him, grey and flat. Ready the fleet. If Stark wins, we sail within the fortnight. The eve of judgment. The night before the trial, King's Landing did not sleep. The city had been building toward this day for 2 weeks, and the tension had accumulated like water behind a dam. Pressure increasing with every hour, every rumor, every sharpened sword and whispered prayer. The taverns were full. The septs were fuller. The street of steel rang with the sound of armorers working through the night, because half the knights in the city had decided that their breastplates needed adjusting, and their helms needed polishing, and their swords needed edges that could cut silk, even though most of them would be watching from the crowd and not swinging anything heavier than a wine cup. The yard before the Great Sept had been prepared. The ground was raked and levelled and covered with fresh sand, tournament sand, hauled from the pits south of the city, white and fine and good for footing. Wooden barriers enclosed a space 60 yards long and 40 wide. Stands had been erected along the northern and southern edges, tiered benches for the nobility, open ground at the back for the commons. The High Septon's elevated platform stood at the eastern end, draped in cloth of silver, with the 7-pointed star carved into the wooden railing and crystal prisms hung from the canopy to catch the morning light. This was not a tournament. There would be no jousting, no melee rules, no yield accepted, until one side could no longer fight. A trial by 7 was war in miniature, 7 against 7, with weapons and armor of their choice, fighting until one side was dead or defeated or unable to continue. The only rule was the one the gods imposed. The side that won was right. In the Red Keep, Ned Stark was brought from his cell for the first time in a fortnight. They took him up through the tunnels and the service corridors and into a chamber in the lower keep, a small room with a window, a bed, a table bearing food and wine, and a set of armor that someone had found in the armory and adjusted to fit a man of Ned's build. It was plain steel, no ornamentation, no colors, no house sigil. Ned's own armor, the grey plate with the direwolf helm, had been seized during his arrest and was presumably melted down, or claimed by someone who considered it a trophy. He stood at the window and looked out at the city. He could see the torches on the Street of the Sisters, the distant glow of the Dragon Pit Quarter, the dark mass of the Blackwater beyond the walls. The air was warm and smelled of salt and cooking smoke and horse, and after 14 days of dungeon stone and bucket stink, the sheer presence of wind on his face was enough to close his eyes and stand in it the way a parched man stands in rain. His leg ached, the bone was knitting. Slowly, imperfectly, with the kind of healing that would leave a limp for the rest of his life if he survived long enough to have one. He could stand. He could walk, if walking meant a dragging, stiff-legged stride that covered ground at half a healthy man's pace. He could grip a sword. Whether he could swing one hard enough to matter in a fight against armored men was a question he preferred to leave unanswered until the morning. A knock at the door. Then the door opened, and his champions entered. Barristan Selmy came first. He was dressed in plain armor, not the white plate of the King's Guard, but good castle-forged steel without decoration. His white cloak was gone. In its place he wore a grey surcoat, belted at the waist, with no device on the breast. His face was calm in the way that a mountain is calm, massive, weathered, and not inclined to move. Lord Stark. Sir Barristan. Ned gripped the old knight's forearm. The gesture was awkward. They had never been close, never been more than courteous acquaintances, but the grip carried a weight that formality could not hold. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me if we're alive tomorrow evening. Behind Barristan came the others. Alan, young, scared, wearing borrowed mail that was slightly too large for his frame. He had been shaved and cleaned up since his time hiding in Flea Bottom, and he looked like what he was. A boy of 20 who had watched his friends die and been unable to stop it, and was now volunteering to walk into a fight that might kill him, because the alternative was living with the knowledge that he had run when his lord needed him. Sir Robar Royce entered with the measured step of a man who had already made his peace and was operating on the far side of fear. He wore bronze and iron armor in the Vale style, functional, heavy, designed for mountain warfare rather than tournament display. He carried a longsword and a round shield with no emblem. He nodded to Ned without speaking. Sir Glendon Flowers came in grinning. The Hedge Knight had been given a suit of mail by one of the armourers on the Street of Steel, donated, rumour had it, by a smith who remembered Ned's justice and wanted his hammer to count for something. The mail was decent. The sword was better, a good blade with a leather grip and a crossguard shaped like a hawk's wings. Glendon handled it with the easy familiarity of a man who had spent more of his life holding steel than holding anything else. Lord Stark. This is the finest company I've kept since the last time I slept in a ditch with a sword and a prayer. Sir Glendon, I'm told you fight for your name. I fight for whatever's left when the fighting's done. If that's a name, I'll take it. Sir Marlon Manderley entered with the careful steps of a large man trying not to trip on the threshold, and his face carried the expression of someone who had committed himself to a course of action and was now deeply, privately, and continuously questioning whether that commitment had been wise. Lord Stark. My lord cousin sends his regards. He would have come himself, but he is, Lord Women is, in White Harbour. I know. Tell me later, Sir Marlon. Tonight we don't need words. Brother Clement entered last. He was the largest of Ned's champions, except Marlon, broad-shouldered, thick-armed, with the rough hands of a smith and the hard face of a man who had buried his family and found religion in the wreckage. His mace hung from a loop at his hip, and the 7-pointed star around his neck caught the lamplight and threw a small constellation of reflections across the wall. He did not speak. He knelt before Ned, touched the 7-pointed star to his forehead, and rose. 7. Ned looked at them. These 6 men who had come to fight for a lord most of them had never met, for reasons that ranged from honour to ambition to faith to northern loyalty to the sheer stubbornness of men who could not turn away from a fight that felt righteous, even when the odds said righteous was a polite word for doomed. Sit, he said, and eat. Tomorrow we fight. Tonight we eat and talk and learn each other's names, because a man should know the names of the men beside him before the swords come out. They sat. They ate. The conversation was stilted at first, the stiff awkwardness of strangers sharing a last meal that might be exactly that. But the food and the wine loosened it, and by the second hour they were talking about weapons and tactics and the practical challenges of fighting 7 armoured men in a sand yard with the eyes of the city on them. Barristan led the tactical discussion. His voice was low and precise, the voice of a man who had fought in more battles than most of them had lived through years. Their strongest fighter is the Hound. Sandor Clegane, 6.5 feet, 17 stone of muscle, fights with a longsword and no shield. He is fast for his size and brutal beyond what you'd expect from a man who hasn't seen a real war. His weakness is his left side. He protects the burned half of his face instinctively, which opens his ribs. Do not go for the face. He will kill you before you land the blow. Go for the ribs. Make him turn. Force him to defend where he doesn't want to defend. Glendon poured wine. And if he doesn't turn, then you're dead. I will engage Clegane. The rest of you, stay away from him. The others? Mandon Moore is the most dangerous of the remaining 6. He fights with the patience of a man who has no emotions to disrupt. He waits, watches, and strikes when you are committed. Do not overextend against him. Do not try to draw him out. He will not be drawn. Treat him like a trap. Move around him, engage from angles, and do not let him isolate you. Barristan looked at each of them in turn. His eyes lingered on Alan, the youngest, the least experienced, the most likely to die in the first exchange. Alan, You stay close to Lord Stark. Your job is not to fight. Your job is to keep anyone from reaching Lord Stark's wounded side. If someone comes at him from the left, you are the shield. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Sir Robar. You are the best fighter here after me. Take the center. Engage whoever Mandan Moore does not, and be ready to move. I may need you. Robar nodded. Sir Glendon, Sir Marlon, Brother Clement. You three form the right flank. Your job is to hold. Not advance, hold. Keep the Crown's men from circling behind us. If they push, give ground slowly. If one of them breaks through, call out and let someone else deal with it. Do not try to be hero. Heroes die first. What about Meryn Trant? Marlon asked. Trant is a bully who fights frightened men and children. He will collapse if pressed by someone who is not afraid of him. He is your target, Sir Marlon. Find him, hit him, and do not stop hitting him until he yields or falls. And Ilyn Payne? Sir Ilyn is the king's justice. He wields a greatsword, and he has been executing men for 20 years. He is strong, experienced, and utterly without mercy. He also has no tongue, which means he cannot yield even if he wants to. If you fight Payne, fight to kill. The room absorbed this. And me? Ned asked. Barristan looked at him. The look was frank and carried no deference, the look of a soldier assessing a wounded man's ability to contribute. My lord, your leg will not support a sustained fight. You will be targeted, the Crown will see your injury and send their weakest fighter to finish you, because killing the accused early would destroy morale. You must not let them. Stay upright. Keep your sword moving. If you go down, Alyn covers you. If Alyn goes down, I fight from the ground. Barristan held his gaze. Then he nodded. Once, and the nod contained the soldier's respect for a man who understands his own limitations and intends to fight anyway. Tomorrow, Barristan said, at dawn. The gods will judge. In another part of the Red Keep, in the chambers reserved for the Kingsguard, Sandor Clegane sat on his bed and sharpened his sword and thought about burning. He did not think about the trial. The trial was a fight. He had been in fights since he was 12, and his brother held his face to the coals, and every fight since then had been a variation on the same theme: pain and rage, and the discovery that hurting other people was the only reliable way to stop the hurt inside himself. He would fight well tomorrow. He always fought well. The fighting was not the problem. The problem was the burning face in the mirror that he did not look at. The problem was the boy king who gave orders with his mother's cruelty and none of her intelligence. The problem was the white cloak they had draped over his shoulders, a cloak meant for honorable men, a cloak Barristan Selmy had worn for 40 years, and that now sat on the shoulders of a man who had killed a butcher's boy on a king's order, because the king's order was easier to obey than the silence that would follow if he refused. He sharpened the sword. The stone rasped against the edge in a rhythm that was almost calming. Barristan would be there tomorrow. Barristan, who had been his commander for 2 years, and whose quiet, unshakable honor had made Sandor simultaneously admire and hate the old man. Admire because Barristan was the genuine article. Hate because the genuine article made everyone else look counterfeit. Selmy had never looked at Sandor with contempt. He had looked at him with something worse: recognition, as though he saw the man Sandor might have been if the world had not burned it out of him. Tomorrow he would try to kill Barristan Selmy. Or Barristan would try to kill him. Or they would both try simultaneously, and the gods, if there were gods, which Sandor doubted in the way that a man doubts the floor beneath him while standing on it, would decide which one fell. He finished sharpening. He sheathed the sword. He lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep, because sleep required the kind of surrender that Sandor Clegane had never been willing to grant to anything. In the Maiden Vault, Sansa Stark sat by the window and watched the torches move through the streets below, small flames carried by invisible hands, a river of fire flowing toward the Great Sept. She was 11 years old. She had been in the Red Keep for months, long enough for the fairy tale to rot from the inside, revealing the worms beneath the gold and the cruelty beneath the courtesy. She had watched Joffrey's face when her father was arrested, the smile, the bright-eyed pleasure of a boy who had found a new game, and she had understood, with a clarity that no amount of songs and stories had prepared her for, that the prince she had loved was a monster wearing a crown. Her father was alive. Her father had demanded a trial. Tomorrow, men would fight and bleed and die to prove that her father had told the truth, and Sansa did not know whether to hope for their victory or to dread it, because victory meant her father went free, and she remained a hostage. And defeat meant her father died, and she remained a hostage, and either way the cage was the same, and either way the princess in the song was not rescued, but trapped in a tower that grew smaller with every day. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the torches and prayed to the mother for mercy, and to the warrior for strength, and to any god who would listen for a morning that brought something other than blood. Dawn came grey and windless. The city woke to the sound of 40,000 people converging on the Great Sept of Baelor. The trial by 7. The yard before the Great Sept of Baelor filled before the sun cleared the eastern wall. They came from every quarter of the city, merchants and fishmongers and washerwomen and dockworkers and tavern keepers and their apprentices and their children, pressing through the streets in a current that flowed from every gate and every alley toward the white stone plaza where the sept rose against the sky like a monument to the proposition that the gods cared about human justice. The city watch had deployed 200 gold cloaks to manage the crowd, and they were not enough. By the time the stands were full, the overflow had spilled into every street and alley within sight of the sept, and boys had climbed the walls and rooftops and statues for a vantage point. And the noise, the vast composite roar of 40,000 voices, rose and fell in waves like the surf against a cliff. The nobles were already seated. The timber stands along the north and south sides of the yard held the court, lords and ladies in silks and velvets and furs despite the late summer warmth, their faces arranged into expressions of decorum that could not entirely conceal the appetite for blood that underlay the occasion. This was not a tournament. No one pretended otherwise. But the proximity of death gave the morning a charge that no tournament could match, and the lords and ladies leaned forward in their seats and watched the sand yard with the focused attention of predators who had paid for the privilege of observing a kill. Cersei sat in the royal box with Joffrey at her side. The boy wore his crown and a black doublet embroidered with golden stags, and his face carried the flushed, bright-eyed excitement of a child who had been promised a treat and was impatient for its delivery. Cersei wore crimson. Her expression was composed, lips set, eyes level. The mask of a woman who had prepared for every outcome and was confident in the preparation. Her hands were folded in her lap, and only a close observer would have noticed that her right thumb was digging into the flesh of her left palm with enough force to leave a bruise. Tommen sat beside her, 7 years old, round-faced and anxious. He had been told that the day's events were important, but had not been told why, and the uncertainty made his lower lip tremble. Myrcella was beside him, 9, golden-haired, her mother's beauty in miniature, and she held Tommen's hand beneath the folds of her skirt where no one could see it. The High Septon rose from his elevated platform at the eastern end of the yard. He was a portly man in robes of white and cloth of silver, his crystal crown catching the morning light and splitting it into rainbows that scattered across the sand. His voice, amplified by the acoustics of the sept's forecourt, carried to the edges of the crowd. In the sight of the gods, the father, the mother, the warrior, the maiden, the smith, the crone, and the stranger, we are assembled to witness a trial by 7. The accused, Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell, has invoked his sacred right to divine judgment. The crown has accepted. The champions of each side will fight until one side can no longer continue. And the outcome shall be taken as the will of the gods. May the truth be known. May justice be done. The crowd murmured. The High Septon stepped back. The yard lay open and white in the morning sun, and the sand glittered like crushed bone. The crown's champions entered from the western gate. They came in formation, a line of 7, armoured and helmed, their weapons drawn. Sandor Clegane led them, and his presence at the front of the line produced a sound from the crowd that was half gasp, and half sigh. Because the hound was enormous, and his armor was dark, and his sword was the length of a man's leg. And the sight of him advancing across the sand was the sight of a natural disaster that had been given a blade. Behind him came Sir Mandon Moore, slender, pale-eyed behind his visor, carrying a long sword and shield with the white star of the Kingsguard. Sir Meryn Trant followed, his face invisible behind the visor of his helm, his movements stiff with the tension of a man who had never fought anything he was not certain of beating. Sir Preston Greenfield, solid and square, his shield arm steady. Sir Aerys Oakhart, who moved with the reluctance of a man walking towards something his body did not want and his oath required. Sir Boros Blount, pale and sweating, his sword hand already damp inside his gauntlet. And Sir Ilyn Payne, last in line. The King's Justice, tongueless and terrible, his greatsword resting on his shoulder. His face a blank behind the steel helm that concealed everything except the dead patience of his eyes. 7 men in white cloaks and dark armor, the fighting arm of the crown, assembled in the yard before the Great Sept to prove by steel that Eddard Stark was a traitor and a liar. The crowd's noise rose. Then it fell, abruptly, like a wave pulling back from a cliff, as the eastern gate opened and Ned Stark's champions entered. Barristan Selmy led them. He wore his grey surcoat over plain steel, and he carried a longsword and a shield, no device on either. His hair was white, and his face was weathered, and his stride was the stride of a man who had walked onto fields like this 100 times, and intended to walk off this one. The crowd stirred when they saw him. They knew his face. They had watched him ride in tournaments and lead charges and stand guard behind 3 kings, and the sight of him on the wrong side of the yard, opposite the Kingsguard he had commanded, opposite the crown he had served, produced a murmur that rippled through the stands and carried a confusion of emotions that no one in the crowd could have named. Behind him came Alyn, young, thin-faced, wearing borrowed mail, carrying a sword and no shield. His eyes moved constantly, scanning the opposing line the way a rabbit scans a field. Sir Robar Royce followed in his bronze and iron plate, heavy and deliberate, his long sword drawn and his shield braced. Sir Glendon Flowers walked with the loose-limbed ease of a man who had fought in ditches and alleys and was not impressed by sandyards, and his grin was the grin of a man who was terrified and had decided to enjoy it. Sir Marlon Manderley came next, thick-bodied, steady, his grandfather's long sword in his hand and his grandfather's name on his lips in a prayer the crowd could not hear. Brother Clement followed with his mace on his shoulder and his 7-pointed star catching the light, and his face set in an expression of absolute, unwavering conviction that the gods were present and watching and would act. And last, Eddard Stark. He walked with a limp that was visible from the stands, his left leg dragged, not uselessly, but with a stiffness that announced to every eye in the yard that the man was wounded and fighting anyway. He wore the plain steel armor that had been provided, and he carried a long sword that he held in his right hand, with a grip that was steady despite the pain. His face was drawn and pale and thin from 2 weeks in the cells, and his beard had grown into a rough scrub that aged him by 10 years, and his grey eyes were the only part of him that looked strong. The crowd went silent. Not the hush of anticipation, the silence of disbelief. The accused was fighting in his own trial, on a broken leg, against 7 of the crown's finest killers. The silence carried a question that no one spoke aloud, but everyone understood. What kind of man does this? The 2 lines faced each other across 40 yards of white sand. 14 men, 14 swords, 2 maces, 1 greatsword. The morning sun was behind the crown's champions, throwing their shadows long across the yard, and Ned's champions squinted into the light and did not step back. The High Septon raised his crystal-topped staff. May the gods judge justly. Begin, he brought the staff down. The crystal struck the platform with a sound like a bell, and the sound was swallowed by the roar of the crowd as both lines began to move. They did not charge. Not at first. Both sides advanced at a walk, the deliberate, measured pace of men who understood that the first rush was where plans died and discipline collapsed. Barristan was 3 steps ahead of his line, his shield up, his sword low. Sandor Clegane mirrored him on the opposite side, his long sword held in both hands, his pace unhurried, and his eyes locked on the old knight, the way a dog's eyes lock on a bone. At 20 yards, the walk became a jog. At 10, the jog became a run. At 5, the 2 lines met. The collision was deafening. Steel struck steel, and the yard erupted into chaos. Not the choreographed chaos of a tournament melee, but the raw, grinding, ugly chaos of men trying to kill each other with edged weapons in a confined space. The sand kicked up in clouds. The crowd's roar became a continuous wall of sound that made communication impossible. Barristan hit Clegane first. The old knight drove in from the left, faster than a man of 63 had any right to be, and his sword came in low, aimed at the gap between Clegane's hip plate and his coos. Clegane blocked it with a downward parry that sent sparks skittering across the sand, and the force of the block drove Barristan's blade into the ground. Clegane reversed and swung, a horizontal slash at Barristan's neck, and Barristan dropped beneath it, letting the blade pass over his helm by inches, and came up with a thrust that caught Clegane's vambress and scraped along the steel without penetrating. They separated, circled, the crowd screamed, and around them, the rest of the fight was already going wrong. Sir Glendon Flowers, the hedge knight who fought for his name, lasted 43 seconds. He had been assigned to the right flank, and he held it for exactly long enough to exchange 2 blows with Sir Meryn Trant before Sir Ilyn Payne came from his blind side. The King's Justice swung his greatsword in a flat arc that caught Glendon between the shoulder and the neck, and the impact was so great that Glendon's body twisted sideways and his feet left the sand. He went down hard, face first, and the greatsword came down again, once, twice, and Glendon Flowers, who had come to King's Landing looking for a name, found one in the songs they would sing about the trial, though he would not hear them. The crowd gasped. First blood, first death had gone to the crown. Sir Marlon Manderly saw Glendon fall, and the sight unlocked something in him. Not courage, which he had always possessed, but the killing fury of a man who has just watched a stranger die for the same cause he is fighting for, and whose death makes the cause heavier and more real. He charged Meryn Trant with a roar that carried above the crowd noise, and the 2 men met in a crash of steel that drove Trant backward 3 steps. Marlon was heavier and angrier, and his swings came with the weight of a man who had decided that he was going to die today and intended to take someone with him. Trant rallied. He caught Marlon's blade on his shield and riposted with a thrust that slid under Marlon's guard and punched through the mail at his left side, below the ribs. Marlon staggered. The wound was deep. Blood ran down his leg and pooled in the sand beneath his left boot, but he kept his feet and swung again. And the blow caught Trant's helm and rang it like a bell, and Trant stumbled, and Marlon hit him again and again, driving the Kingsguard knight across the sand with a series of overhand chops that had no finesse and no technique and no pity. Trant went to one knee. His shield arm was broken. The last blow had caught the joint of his elbow, and the bone had snapped audibly above the crowd noise. He raised his sword in his right hand, and Marlon knocked it aside and hit him in the face with the flat of his blade, and Meryn Trant pitched forward into the sand and did not rise. Marlon stood over him, swaying. The blood from his side was running freely now, and the sand beneath him was dark with it, and his face was the color of wet chalk. He turned to find his next opponent and found Sir Ilyn Payne. The King's Justice had wiped Glendon's blood from his greatsword on his own cloak and was advancing toward Marlon with the unhurried pace of a man who had just finished one task and was moving to the next. His face was blank. His eyes were empty. He raised the greatsword above his right shoulder, and Marlon Manderly, bleeding from a wound that was going to kill him within the hour regardless, raised his own sword and met him. The exchange was brief. Marlon was weakened and slowing, and Payne was fresh and uninjured and possessed of the mechanical efficiency of a man who had been killing people as a vocation. 3 blows. Marlon blocked the first, deflected the second, and missed the third. The greatsword took him in the thigh, the left leg above the knee, and the cut went through the mail, and the muscle beneath and Marlon dropped like a felled tree. He hit the sand and did not get up. 2 of Ned's champions were down. The trial was less than 3 minutes old. In the center of the yard, Barristan and Clegane were still fighting. It was the kind of duel that bards would sing about and soldiers would argue about, and no one who witnessed it would ever forget. Barristan was the superior technician. His footwork was flawless, his blade work economical, his defense a wall of precisely timed parries and deflections that turned Clegane's enormous power against itself. Every time the hound swung, Barristan was a half step to the side, letting the blow pass, redirecting it into empty air, and answering with a counter that was faster and sharper than anything a man of his age should have been capable of. But Clegane was younger and stronger and driven by a fury that technique could not extinguish. He absorbed Barristan's counters, took a cut across his left vambrace, a dent in his helm, a shallow gash on his right forearm, and kept coming. His sword was a constant threat, long, heavy, swinging in arcs that could shatter a shield or cleave through armor at the joints. He was not trying to outfight Barristan. He was trying to outlast him, exhaust him, wait for the old knight's legs to slow and his arms to tire, and the years to catch up with the skill. Barristan knew it. He could feel his breathing growing heavier, his shoulders burning from the accumulated weight of 100 parries, the creep of fatigue that was the truth behind the legend, that even the finest swordsman in the 7 kingdoms was 63 years old and had not fought a real battle in 2 years. He needed to end this. Soon, across the yard, Brother Clement fought Sir Preston Greenfield. The begging brother's mace was a revelation. Greenfield had expected a slow, heavy weapon, the kind that farmers and brigands swung with more enthusiasm than skill. What he got was a weapon wielded by a man who had been a soldier before he was a smith, and a smith before he was a brother, and whose arm had spent 30 years shaping iron and retained the speed and precision that most men half his age could not match. The mace came in low, under Greenfield's shield, aimed at his knee. Greenfield jumped back, and the mace struck the sand, and Clement reversed and brought it up in a backhand that caught the bottom edge of Greenfield's shield and drove it into his chest. Greenfield stumbled. Clement hit him again, shoulder, ribs, helm, 3 blows in rapid succession, and each one drove Greenfield further back and loosened his grip on his shield arm. But Greenfield was Kingsguard, and Kingsguard did not fall easily. He recovered, planted his feet, and lunged with a thrust that caught Clement in the left arm, above the elbow. The blade went through the mail and into the muscle beneath, and Clement grunted, and his left hand went slack, and the shield he had been holding dropped to the sand. Without the shield, he was exposed. Greenfield pressed, thrust, cut, thrust, driving Clement backward, opening the wound wider with each exchange. Clement's mace was still in his right hand, but without the left to balance and protect, he was fighting with half his body. He did not retreat. He roared, a sound that was not language, but something older and rawer, and charged. The mace came overhead in a 2-handed grip, and the blow landed on the top of Greenfield's helm with the full force of a blacksmith's arm behind it. The helm crumpled. Greenfield's legs buckled. He went down, and the sand caught him, and he did not move. Clement stood over the body, panting. Blood ran from his left arm in a steady stream that darkened the sand. His face held an expression that was equal parts pain and savage satisfaction. Then Sir Mandon Moore, who had been circling the edge of the fight and waiting and watching and choosing his moment with the cold precision that Barristan had warned them about, stepped in from Clement's blind left side and drove his sword through the begging brother's back. Clement looked down. The blade emerged from beneath his ribs, dark with blood, and he stared at it with the expression of a man who has just received a message he was not expecting. His hand opened. The mace dropped. He fell to his knees, then forward, and the 7-pointed star around his neck pressed into the sand and left an imprint that the wind would erase within the hour. 3 of Ned's champions were dead. 3 of the crowns were down. Glendon fallen to pain, Marlon fallen to pain, Clement fallen to Moore. On the crown's side, Greenfield was down, and Trant was down, and the numbers were now 4 against 5, Barristan, Alyn, Robar, and Ned against Clegane, Moore, Oakhart, Blount, and Payne. The crowd was on its feet. The noise was beyond words, a wall of sound that pressed against the barriers and made the air vibrate and turned the yard into a cauldron of human attention, so concentrated it had weight and heat. Sir Robar Royce killed Sir Ilyn Payne. The Vale Knight had been fighting on the right flank, holding his position, absorbing the blows that came his way with the patient defense that mountain warfare taught and tournament fighting did not. He had taken a cut across his thigh from Aerys Oakheart and a dent in his shield from Boros Blount, and he had given back as good as he got, a gash on Oakheart's forearm, a shattered rim on Blount's shield that left the coward's left side exposed. When Ilyn Payne turned from Marlon's body and moved toward Ned, drawn to the wounded man's limp like a predator drawn to blood, Robar saw it and moved. He crossed the 10 yards between them at a dead run, shield raised, and hit Payne from the side before the king's justice could reach Ned. The impact drove Payne sideways and sent his greatsword wide, and Robar followed with a combination, 2 short chops at Payne's sword arm, a shield bash to the face, and a thrust that went into the gap between Payne's gorget and his shoulder plate and found flesh. Payne staggered. Blood ran from the wound in a pulsing stream. He tried to raise the greatsword, but the damaged shoulder would not obey, and the blade swung low and slow, and Robar stepped inside the arc and drove his longsword into Payne's side, below the arm, where the armor gaped. The king's justice fell. He fell without sound. No cry, no curse, no plea, because the king, who had taken his tongue, had taken the last thing Ilyn Payne might have said. He hit the sand face down, and his fingers twitched on the greatsword's grip, and then went still. Robar pulled his blade free and turned, and found himself facing Sir Aerys Oakheart. Oakheart had been fighting with the visible reluctance of a man whose oath demanded combat and whose conscience demanded something else. He had injured Robar. The thigh wound was real and painful. But he had not pressed when pressing would have killed. He had held back, fought at 3/4 speed, chosen to wound rather than kill, and the pattern was visible to anyone who understood fighting well enough to see it. He saw Robar turn. He saw the blood on the Vale Knight's sword. He saw the body of Ilyn Payne on the sand, and the body of Brother Clement, and the body of Sir Glendon, and he looked across the yard at the boy king in the stands, who had ordered this spectacle, and who was leaning forward in his seat with a smile. Aerys Oakheart lowered his sword. "I yield," he said. The words were barely audible above the crowd, but the gesture, the lowered sword, the dropped shield, the open hands was visible to everyone, and the crowd's roar shifted pitch. A Kingsguard knight yielding. In a trial by 7. The implications ricocheted through the stands in a wave of whispered outrage and whispered admiration that split the audience down the middle. Joffrey was on his feet. "Get back up. Fight. I command you." Oakheart did not look at him. He walked to the edge of the yard, sat on the barrier, and removed his helm. His face was sweating and drawn, and held the expression of a man who had just broken an oath and discovered that breaking it hurt less than keeping it. The numbers shifted. 4 against 3 now. Barristan, Alyn, Robar, and Ned against Clegane, Moore, and Blount. Sir Boros Blount looked at the field. He looked at Mandon Moore, who was pulling his sword from Brother Clement's back. He looked at the Hound, who was still trading blows with Barristan in the centre of the yard. He looked at the 3 dead men on his own side, and the one who had yielded. Then he looked at Ned Stark, wounded, limping, standing on his broken leg, with his sword raised and his grey eyes fixed on Boros with the quiet, inflexible challenge of a man who would not stop. Boros Blount ran. He dropped his sword and shield and ran for the barrier, and the crowd erupted, not with the roar of battle, but with the unmistakable sound that accompanies public cowardice, a mix of jeering and laughter and contempt that followed Blount across the sand like stones thrown at a retreating dog. He vaulted the barrier and disappeared into the crowd, and his white cloak caught on a nail and tore. And the torn piece hung from the wood like a flag of surrender. Joffrey was screaming. Cersei's hand was on his shoulder, pressing him back into his seat, and her face was no longer composed, but rigid with the effort of controlling a situation that was sliding sideways. 4 against 2. Barristan and Clegane, Robar and Mor, Alyn guarding Ned. Ned stood in the sand and watched and bled and held his sword and felt the broken bone in his leg grating with every breath, and the pain was extraordinary, and the morning was bright, and the gods, his gods, the old gods who carved faces in weirwoods and watched from the heart trees of the north, were present, or they were not, and he would know by sundown. Barristan ended the duel with Clegane in the 7th minute. The old knight had been conserving energy, conserving speed, conserving the one burst of explosive movement that he had been saving for the moment when Clegane's guard dropped by a fraction of an inch. Fighting Clegane was like fighting the sea. Relentless, overwhelming, a force that could not be matched on its own terms. But the sea had rhythms, and Barristan had spent 60 years learning to read them. Clegane overcommitted. A downward stroke aimed at Barristan's left shoulder, powerful, fast, but a quarter second longer than his previous swings. Because even the hound's endurance was not infinite, and the accumulated fatigue of 7 minutes of combat against the finest swordsman alive was beginning to tell. The stroke came down, and Barristan was not there. He had stepped left, not back, left, and the hound's blade hit the sand, and Barristan's blade came up in a rising cut that caught Clegane under the right arm, in the gap where the breastplate met the pauldron, and the edge bit deep. Clegane roared, not with pain, with fury, the fury of a man who has been wounded by someone he was supposed to kill. He spun, trailing blood, and his backhand swing had enough force to decapitate a horse, but Barristan was inside the arc, too close for the blade to reach him, chest to chest with the larger man, and he drove the pommel of his sword into the burned side of Clegane's face. The hound screamed. Not a roar, a scream, high and raw, and carrying every buried memory of the coals and the brother and the burning that lived beneath his skin. He lurched backward, his left hand going to his face, his right still holding the sword, but the grip weakening. And Barristan followed and struck. Once, twice, 3 times. Arm, leg, the flat of the blade against Clegane's sword hand, snapping the wrist. The hound's sword fell. He staggered, his knees buckled. He went down on all fours, bleeding from 3 wounds, his burned face pressed against the sand, his breathing a ragged snarl. Barristan stood over him with his sword at the hound's neck. Yield, Clegane looked up. His eyes, the one beneath the scars and the one that still worked, found Barristan's, and the look that passed between them was the look of 2 men who understood each other in the way that only men who have tried to kill each other can. "Fuck your yield," Clegane said. But his sword was gone, and his wrist was broken, and his blood was in the sand, and the word was acknowledgement rather than defiance. He stayed down. 1 champion remained for the crown. Sir Mandon Moore stood in the centre of the yard with Brother Clement's blood still on his sword and his blank eyes sweeping the field. He was unwounded. He had fought with the surgical patience that Barristan had described, circling, waiting, striking only when the opportunity was perfect. He had killed Clement from behind and had not troubled himself with the messiness of a straight fight. He faced Barristan across 20 feet of sand, and neither man moved. Then Moore did something unexpected. He turned away from Barristan and charged Ned. It was a calculated move. Kill the accused, and the trial ended, not in the Crown's favour, strictly speaking, since Ned's side still had fighters standing. But the death of the accused would achieve the political objective regardless of the legal outcome. Moore had assessed the field, identified the weakest target, and committed. He was fast. Faster than his previous careful movements had suggested. He crossed the 20 feet in 3 strides, and his sword came at Ned's head in a flat arc that would have split his skull if it had landed. Alyn stepped between them. The young Stark guardsman, 20 years old, borrowed mail, a sword he had never used in real combat, stepped between Ned and the deadliest remaining fighter on the Crown's side and caught Moore's blade on his own. The impact drove him to his knees. Moore reversed and cut downward, and Alyn rolled, a desperate, graceless motion that saved his life by 6 inches, and came up with his sword in a wild upward slash that caught Moore's shield and did nothing. Moore advanced. Alyn backpedaled. His form was terrible, his defense full of gaps, his footwork the footwork of a man who had been taught to fight by watching other men fight rather than by fighting himself. Moore exploited every gap, a thrust at the knee, a cut at the wrist. A feint that drew Alan's guard high, and then reversed into a low slash that opened a wound across the young man's left thigh. Alan cried out. He stumbled. His left leg buckled, and he went to one knee, and Moore raised his sword for the killing blow. Ned Stark drove his blade into Moore's right arm from behind. It was not an elegant stroke. It was not a technique that any master at arms would have recognized or approved. It was the desperate lunge of a crippled man who saw his guard about to die and threw his body forward and drove the steel into the first opening he could reach. The blade went through the gap between Moore's vambrace and his gauntlet, through the leather and padding beneath, and into the muscle of the forearm. Moore dropped his sword. He spun, the reflex of a fighter whose weapon hand has been compromised, and his shield came around in a backhand that caught Ned across the face and sent him sprawling into the sand. Ned's broken leg twisted beneath him, and the white heat of the bone shifting blotted out everything. Sight, sound, thought. The sand was in his mouth, and the sun was in his eyes, and the pain was a living thing that had swallowed him. Moore scooped his sword up with his left hand. He was right-handed, and the left was slower, clumsier. But the man was Kingsguard, and a Kingsguard knight could fight with either hand in any condition. He raised the blade above Ned's prone form. Robar Royce's sword caught Moore in the side of the helm. The Vale Knight had crossed the yard in the seconds after Moore's charge, and the blow was a full-speed running strike that connected with enough force to crack the steel of Moore's helm and snap his head to the right. Moore staggered sideways, his left hand grip weakening, and Robar hit him again. Helm, shoulder, helm, driving the Kingsguard knight backward with a series of blows that had the rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer. Moore went down. He went down on his back, and his sword fell from his left hand, and the cracked helm rolled away and revealed a face that was blank and pale and bleeding from the nose and the ears, and that held no expression at all even in defeat. Because Mandon Moore had lived his life without visible emotion and intended to end it the same way. Robar stood over him. Yield. Moore said nothing. His eyes were open but unfocused. The blow to his helm had scrambled something inside his skull, and the word yield arrived at a place in his brain that could no longer process it. He did not rise. The yard went silent. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then the High Septon's voice, thin, trembling, but carrying across the sand with the authority of 3 centuries of precedent. The trial is ended. The accused's champions stand. The gods have spoken. The noise that followed was the sound of a city being split in half. Half the crowd roared, not for Ned, not against him, but for the spectacle, for the blood, for the ancient ceremony that had been performed in their city and that they had witnessed. The other half was silent, the Lannister loyalists, the gold cloaks, the courtiers who had bet on the crown and lost. Joffrey was on his feet, screaming something that no one could hear above the crowd. Cersei's hand was on his arm, and her grip was white-knuckled, and her face was the face of a woman watching a building she had spent years constructing collapse one wall at a time. In the yard, Barristan Selmy sheathed his sword and walked to where Ned lay in the sand. He knelt and helped the Lord of Winterfell sit upright, and Ned's face was grey with pain, and his left leg was a ruin, and his lip was split where Moore's shield had struck him. But his eyes were open, and his sword was still in his hand, and he had not let go of it even when the world had gone white. "It's over," Barristan said. Ned looked at the yard. At the bodies, Glendon, Marlon, Clement, 3 men who had died for him. 3 men whose names he would carry for the rest of his life, alongside Jory and Fat Tom, and Cain, and all the others who had bled, because Eddard Stark had told the truth, and the world had punished him for it. "Help me up," he said. Barristan and Robar lifted him. He stood on his one good leg, swaying, supported by the arms of men who had fought beside him and survived, and the crowd's noise washed over him like a river. And he did not raise his sword in triumph, because triumph was not what he felt. 3 men were dead. The gods had spoken. And the truth about Cersei and Jaime and the boy who sat the Iron Throne had survived, if only barely, if only through blood. Outside the western gate of the yard, a man on a lathered bay courser pushed through the crowd with the desperate energy of a rider who had covered 400 miles in 6 days and killed 2 horses doing it. Sir Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, had arrived in King's Landing 2 hours before dawn and had fought through the crowd to the barriers just in time to watch the last 4 minutes of the trial. He had watched Ned fall. He had watched Alan fight. He had watched Moore go down. He had been too late. The Blackfish leaned against the barrier, breathing hard, his horse trembling behind him, and he watched his niece's husband stand in the sand among the bodies of the men who had died for him, and his face held the expression of a soldier who has arrived at a battle after it ended. The relief of survival tangled with the guilt of absence and the knowledge that he should have ridden faster. The gods' verdict. The High Septon confirmed the verdict at noon in the Great Sept itself, before the altars of the 7 aspects and the assembled witnesses. The ceremony was brief. The law required it. The accused had been judged innocent by divine combat, and the judgment was absolute. No appeal, no review, no revision by king or council or court. Eddard Stark was innocent of the charges of treason. The gods had spoken through steel. The matter was closed. Ned stood before the altar of the Father with Barristan at his right and Robar at his left and Alan behind him, and the High Septon's words washed over him in a current of formal language that he absorbed without processing. He was exhausted. The pain in his leg had settled into a constant grinding agony that the maester's poppy milk had dulled but not silenced. His lip was swollen, his ribs ached from Moore's shield blow, and beneath the physical damage, the deeper pain, the faces of the dead, the weight of survival, pressed against him like a hand on his chest. By the judgment of the gods, Lord Eddard Stark is declared innocent of all charges. No man may speak against him on this matter. No court may try him again. The truth is established, and the case is closed. Ned bowed to the altar. The motion sent a spike of pain through his leg that made his vision swim, and Barristan's hand steadied him, a grip on his forearm, firm and silent, the grip of a man who had held up wounded comrades on a dozen battlefields and whose instinct was older than courtesy. In the royal box, Cersei watched the ceremony with a face that might have been carved from Casterly rock. She had prepared for this outcome, not because she expected it, but because Cersei Lannister prepared for every outcome. And the preparations for defeat were always the most detailed. The immediate problem was Joffrey. The boy was furious, a deep, sulking, dangerous fury that expressed itself in fidgeting and muttering and the periodic clenching of his fists around the arms of his chair. He wanted Ned dead. The trial's result was, in his 13-year-old understanding of justice, an error that could be corrected by a sufficient application of authority. He was the king. The king could overrule the gods. The king could overrule anyone. He walks free, Joffrey hissed. We just let him walk free. No, Cersei said. Her voice was low, pitched for his ears alone. He walks. He does not walk free. What does that mean? It means that Sansa remains here, and as long as Sansa remains here, Eddard Stark is on a leash that reaches from King's Landing to Winterfell and does not break. Joffrey considered this. The concept of a hostage was not new to him, but the subtlety of its application, the idea that a man could be free in body and imprisoned by love, required a kind of thinking that Joffrey's brain could manage only when rage did not crowd it out. At the moment, rage was winning. I want him dead. He cannot be killed. Not now. The gods have judged him innocent. If we kill him after the trial, every lord in the Seven Kingdoms will rise, not because they love Ned Stark, but because the crown has defied divine judgment, and no lord in the realm will trust a crown that kills men the gods have cleared. Cersei put her hand over his. The gesture was maternal and calculated in equal measure. We have Sansa, we have leverage, and when Tywin arrives with the army, We will have the power to reshape the terms. This is not defeat. This is delay. Joffrey looked at her. His green eyes, Jaime's eyes, Cersei's eyes, the eyes that any man with a portrait of Robert and a functioning brain could see, did not belong to a Baratheon, held the coiled darkness of a boy who was deciding whether to obey his mother or defy her. He obeyed. This time. The negotiations began that afternoon. They took place in the Tower of the Hand, a deliberate choice by Cersei, who wanted to remind Ned that the office he had held was no longer his, and that the power he had exercised was now hers. The room was the same one where Ned had once sat and read Jon Arryn's accounts and uncovered the secret that had led him to the cells. The table was the same. The chairs were the same. The view from the window was the same. Only the occupants had changed. Ned sat with Barristan on one side, and Brynden Tully, who had ridden into the Red Keep that morning on a horse so spent it had to be put down, on the other. Across the table sat Cersei, flanked by Littlefinger and Pycelle. Lord Stark has been judged innocent, Cersei said. The Crown acknowledges the verdict. The charges are withdrawn. And my daughter? Ned said. Your daughter is a guest of the court. She will remain as a guest until the political situation between the Crown and the North is resolved. She is a hostage. She is a guest. The distinction may seem academic, but it determines whether she sleeps in the Maiden Vault or the cells. I suggest you accept the terminology. The Blackfish's hand tightened on the table's edge. Ned saw it and placed his own hand on Brynden's forearm, a restraint that cost him nothing to apply and everything to maintain, because the rage inside him was no smaller than the Blackfish's. He simply had more practice containing it. What are the terms? Ned asked. You are free to leave King's Landing. You are free to return to the North. You are free to govern Winterfell and command your bannermen as you see fit, provided that those bannermen do not march south of the Neck. Cersei's voice was level, rehearsed, every word positioned like a tile in a mosaic. In exchange, Sansa remains at court until a permanent peace is negotiated. She will be treated with all the courtesies due her station. She will not be harmed. And if I refuse? If you refuse, you remain a free man in a city controlled by the Crown, surrounded by an army loyal to the Crown, with your daughter in the Crown's keeping. The gods have judged you innocent, Lord Stark. They did not judge you invulnerable. Ned looked at Littlefinger. The Master of Coin met his eyes with a smile that communicated complicity and amusement, and something colder beneath both. The smile of a man who had betrayed Ned once, and was now sitting across the table from the man he had betrayed, and whose position in the game remained, inexplicably, unchanged. Lord Baelish, Ned said. Does the Council endorse these terms? The Council endorses whatever keeps the realm from burning, Lord Stark. At present, that means a compromise that satisfies no one, which, in my experience, is the definition of good policy. Ned turned to Barristan. The old knight shook his head, not in disagreement, but in disgust, a slow lateral motion that said this is the world we live in more clearly than words. I accept, Ned said, on conditions. Sansa is not to be harmed. She is not to be married without my consent. She is to be permitted to write to her family, and her letters are not to be intercepted or altered. Any violation of these terms releases the North from whatever peace we negotiate. Agreed, Cersei said. Too quickly. The speed of her agreement told Ned everything he needed to know about how much the terms would be honored. And I want the bodies of my champions returned to me. Sir Glendon Flowers, Sir Marlon Manderly, and Brother Clement. I will take them north and bury them where they belong. A flicker of surprise crossed Cersei's face. The bodies are your concern. They fought for me. They died for me. They are my concern until they are in the ground. The negotiation continued for 2 more hours. Details were hammered out, safe conduct through the Crown lands, a raven to Robb ordering the northern forces to halt south of the Neck, a timeline for the peace negotiations that would theoretically follow. By the time it ended, the sun was low and the shadows in the room were long, and Ned was grey with exhaustion and pain and the bone-deep weariness of a man who has been handed his freedom and had to pay for it with his daughter. He left the room leaning on Barristan's arm. The Blackfish walked behind them, his hand on his sword, his eyes moving. Corridor, doorway, shadow, staircase, the watchfulness of a soldier who did not trust the building he was standing in. "You cannot leave Sansa here," Brynden said when they were clear of the council chambers. "I know. The woman will use her. The boy will hurt her. The moment you cross the neck, every promise they made becomes worthless." "I know." "Then why did you agree?" Ned stopped. He turned, his weight on his right leg, his face drawn and hard. "Because if I refuse, I do not leave this city alive. The trial was legal. The terms are not. Cersei will honor them for as long as she finds them useful and discard them the moment she does not. But if I stay, I am a prisoner with no leverage and no army and no way to reach Sansa's cage from inside it. If I leave, I have the North. I have Robb. I have 30,000 men and a grievance that every lord in the Seven Kingdoms will understand." He resumed walking, his leg dragged on the stone. "I will come back for Sansa, with an army or a peace or a trade or whatever it takes. But I cannot do it from a cell. I can only do it from a position of strength, and strength is north of the neck." The Blackfish said nothing. He followed Ned down the corridor, his jaw tight, his silence communicating the argument he had decided not to make, that strength might not be enough, that Cersei Lannister's definition of leverage involved blades and blood and the willingness to use a child as a shield. That evening, in the chamber they had given him in the lower keep, Ned sat with the door barred and the window open and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Robb. He wrote it in his own hand, in the cramped northern script that his son would recognize, and the words were careful and measured and carried the weight of a father trying to communicate love and strategy and caution simultaneously. The second was to Stannis Baratheon. He sealed both with plain wax. No sigil, no impression, nothing that could be identified if intercepted, and gave them to Brynden Tully, who would carry them north through the Kingswood and into the Riverlands by a route that did not touch the King's Road. "Ride ahead of me," Ned told him. "Get these to Robb and get one to Dragonstone. By ship from Maidenpool if you can. Stannis needs to know that the trial proved nothing to the gods and everything to the realm. And what does it prove? That Joffrey's claim is weak enough that the crown could not win a fight the gods were judging. Every lord in the Seven Kingdoms will draw that conclusion. Stannis needs to be ready when they do." Brynden took the letters. He rode out of King's Landing at midnight, through the Dragon Gate, into the darkness of the Kingswood, and the sound of his horse's hooves on the cobblestones faded into the night like the last note of a song whose melody had not yet been written. The price of freedom. They let him see Sansa at dawn. The visit was Cersei's concession, or her cruelty, which amounted to the same thing. 2 guards from the Gold Cloaks stood at the door of the Maiden Vault, and a scepter in grey robes waited inside, and the terms were plain: 10 minutes, no physical contact. And the conversation would be witnessed and reported. Ned accepted the terms because the alternative was leaving King's Landing without seeing his daughter's face, and that was a wound he was not willing to carry north. Sansa was standing when he entered. She had dressed in the grey and white of House Stark, not the silks and ivories she had worn in her early weeks at court. When she had still believed that the capital was the place where songs came true, but the northern wool that her mother had packed for her in Winterfell, before the journey, before the arrest, before the world had sharpened itself against them. She looked thin. The bones of her wrists were visible above the cuffs of her sleeves, and her face had lost the softness that had been the last marker of childhood. She was 11. She looked older. "Father," her voice broke on the word. She took a step forward, then stopped, the scepter's hand on her shoulder, the silent pressure that said you were told the rules. Sansa stopped. She folded her hands in front of her the way her mother folded hers when guests arrived at Winterfell. And Ned saw Cat in the gesture, Cat's composure, Cat's training, the Tully discipline that held form even when everything inside it was collapsing. "Sansa," his voice was rougher than he intended. The pain in his leg had been worsening since he rose, and the effort of walking from the lower keep to the maiden vault had left his right hand trembling on the crutch. "Are you well?" "I am well, my lord, my lord." "Not father." The formality stung, and Ned saw the reason for it in the girl's eyes. She was performing for the audience. The scepter, the guards, the invisible Cersei behind them. Sansa was 11 years old, and she had already learned that the truth was something you said with your eyes, while your mouth said what the people with swords wanted to hear. "I am leaving the city today," Ned said, traveling north. "To Winterfell." "Yes, my lord. I was told." "You are to remain here." "As a guest of the court." "Yes, my lord." Her chin was steady. Her eyes were bright. "I am honored by the Queen's hospitality." The scepter nodded. The guards shifted. The performance was convincing enough to satisfy the witnesses, and devastating enough to crack something inside Ned's chest that he had not known was still whole. He wanted to cross the room. He wanted to put his hands on his daughter's shoulders and tell her the truth. That he would come back for her. That the North would not forget her. That the hostage she had become would not be the woman she remained. He wanted to tell her about Robb and Catelyn and Bran and Rickon, about Winterfell in autumn when the leaves turned and the hot springs steamed in the morning cold, about the godswood where the heart tree watched with carved eyes, and the silence between the sentinels was the silence of something that remembered everything. He could not cross the room. The guards and the scepter stood between them, and the 10 minutes were not 10 minutes of freedom, but 10 minutes of demonstration. Cersei showing Ned the cage his daughter occupied, letting him see its dimensions, letting the shape of it burn itself into his memory, so that every step of the long ride north would carry the weight of what he was leaving behind. "Sansa, listen to me." He lowered his voice. Not a whisper. He would not whisper in front of these people, but low enough that the words were meant for her and no one else. "You are a Stark. Whatever they tell you, whatever they do, that does not change. Do you hear me? I hear you, my lord. Your mother and I will not forget you. Your brother will not forget you. The North does not forget." Sansa's composure held. Her hands did not tremble. Her chin did not drop. She stood like a statue of a girl who had once been real, and the only sign that she was alive beneath the stone was the single tear that tracked down her left cheek and fell from her jaw onto the grey wool of her dress, darkening a spot the size of a coin. "I know, father." She had dropped the formality. One word, father instead of my lord, and it was the word that broke Ned's discipline and sent a fracture through the wall he had built between his grief and the world. He closed his eyes. He breathed. He opened them. "I will see you again, Sansa." The scepter stepped forward. "My lord, your time is, I know." Ned looked at his daughter one last time. She was standing in a rectangle of morning light that came through the window and turned her auburn hair into copper, and her face was still and composed and breaking, and she was 11 years old, and he was about to ride 1,000 miles away from her. He turned and walked out of the room. His leg dragged on the stone. The door closed behind him, and the sound of it was the sound of something that would not open again until he returned with an army, or a peace, or whatever it took to make the closing of that door into a memory instead of a sentence. In the courtyard of the Red Keep, the dead were waiting. 3 carts stood in the morning shadow of the Tower of the Hand, each bearing a body wrapped in white linen and bound with hempen rope. Sir Glendon Flowers, Sir Marlon Manderley, Brother Clement. Their armor had been stripped, the crown kept the steel, as was its right, but their weapons had been returned, and each man's sword or mace lay across his chest with the blade pointing toward his feet. The way the Septons prepared warriors for their passage to the stranger. Ned stood before the carts and said nothing for a long time. The morning traffic of the Red Keep moved around him, servants, guards, horses, the machinery of a court that had already begun to forget the trial and focus on the next crisis, but the space around the 3 carts was empty, as though the dead had drawn a boundary that the living were reluctant to cross. Alan stood behind Ned. The young guardsman's face was drawn, his eyes fixed on the wrapped bodies with the expression of a man who was old enough to have survived a battle and young enough to be destroyed by the surviving. He had known Glendon for 2 weeks and Marlon for less. But the knowledge of men who fight side by side compresses years into hours, and the grief was real. Sir Robar Royce arrived in his travel cloak, his bronze and iron armor packed on a mule. He looked at the carts and removed his helm and held it against his chest. Manderley should go home to White Harbor, Robar said. His family will want him. He will. Ned said, I will take him north myself and deliver him to Lord Wyman. The Manderleys will know that their son died with honor. And Glendon? Glendon said he fought for his name. I will bury him in the lickyard at Winterfell, among the Starks. His name will be on the stone. That is the least of what I owe him. Robar nodded. He looked at the third cart. Brother Clement, whose mace had killed a Kingsguard knight, and whose death had come from behind, from a man too patient to face him squarely. The begging brothers have no burial grounds, Ned said. He wore the 7-pointed star. I will ask the High Septon to take his body and inter him in the Sept. If the High Septon refuses, he comes north with the others. Barristan Selmy crossed the courtyard. He walked with the same measured stride he had carried into the trial, unhurried, balanced, the walk of a man whose body had been trained to conserve energy over distances that other men would have covered at a run. His grey surcoat was clean. His sword was at his hip. He looked, in the morning light, like what he was, a knight without a lord, without a cloak, without an allegiance, a man who had served 3 kings and been dismissed by the 4th, and had fought his way back to something that resembled purpose. The escort is ready, Barristan said. 20 men, Robar's Vale knights, and a handful of household guards that Lord Ricker has lent us. They will see us clear of the Crownlands. And then... Barristan was silent. The question hung between them. Not the logistics of the journey, but the larger question beneath it. What does a man like Barristan Selmy do when the fight is over, and the cause that brought him into it has been won? I will ride north with you, Barristan said. To the Trident, at least. After that, I have decisions to make that I am not ready to make this morning. Ned accepted this. He had learned, over the course of 2 weeks in the cells and 2 days of negotiation, that the old knight's honor operated on its own schedule and could not be hurried. They departed King's Landing through the Dragon Gate at mid-morning, riding north on the King's Road with 3 carts of dead men and the taste of the city's dust in their mouths. The gold cloaks at the gate watched them pass with the flat expressions of men who had been ordered to let the wolves leave and were not sure they agreed with the order. The crowds in the streets, thinner than the trial day's masses, but still present, still watching, parted to let the procession through. Ned rode at the front. His left leg was strapped to the stirrup with leather bindings that held it rigid against the horse's flank, and the pain was a constant presence, dull at rest, sharp on the turns, blinding on the cobblestones where the horse's gait jarred the broken bone. He held the reins in one hand and did not look back. The city fell behind them. The Kingswood rose ahead, dark trees on either side of the road, the shade a relief after the glare of the city's white stone. The air changed. The salt and smoke smell of King's Landing gave way to earth and pine and the faint vegetable decay of a forest floor in late summer, and Ned breathed it in and felt something loosen in his chest. Not a release, not a healing, but the easing of a pressure that had been building since the day he rode south with Robert and agreed to become Hand of the King. The procession moved in silence. The wheels of the dead men's carts creaked on the road. The horses' hooves struck the hard-packed earth. Nobody spoke, because the dead were with them, and the dead commanded a kind of respect that speech could not carry. Ned Stark was free. The gods had judged him innocent. 3 men were dead because of it. His daughter was a hostage. His king was a bastard born of incest, and the road ahead was 1,000 miles long, and every mile of it led toward a war that had not yet been named, but whose shape was already visible to anyone who looked at the cracking fault lines of the realm, and understood what happened when a dynasty's lies were exposed in public. He rode north. The sun climbed. The carts followed. The road north. They reached the Trident on the 5th day. The river was brown and swollen with late summer rain, and the ford at the Ruby Crossing was passable but slow, the water reaching the horses' bellies, the cartwheels grinding against the stones of the riverbed. The current pulling at the white wrapped bundles on the carts with a gentle, persistent insistence that made the escorts nervous. They crossed one cart at a time, with men on either side to steady the load, and the bodies of Glendon and Marlon and Clement made the crossing without incident, which was a mercy of the kind that Ned had stopped expecting. On the far bank, he dismounted, painfully, the leather straps biting his shin as he swung his right leg over, and stood in the mud and looked at the river. This was the place. The Trident, where Robert had killed Rhaegar, where the rubies from the prince's breastplate had scattered into the water and given the ford its name, where the rebellion had been won and the dynasty that had ruled for 300 years had broken against the warhammer of a man who wanted his betrothed back. Ned had stood on this bank 17 years ago with blood in his beard and Robert's laughter in his ears and the prince's body in the shallows. The war had seemed over then. The truth had seemed simple. The right side won, the wrong side fell, and the realm would heal. 17 years, and the healing had produced a different kind of sickness, a boy with his mother's brother's face, sitting a throne he had no right to, and the man who should have been king grinding his teeth on an island and waiting. And the truth buried so deep that it had taken 2 dead hands and a trial by combat to drag it to the surface. Barristan joined him at the water's edge. "I fought here," the old knight said. "I was on the wrong side. Prince Rhaegar's side." He paused. "I was wounded and would have died if your brother-in-law had not spared me. Robert sent his own maester to tend my wounds." Robert was generous with men he had beaten. He was. And he was right to be. A king who kills his enemy's best soldiers is a king who will never lack enemies and always lack soldiers. They stood together, watching the river. The escort was resting the horses on the far bank, and the sounds of camp, bridles jingling, men talking, wood being split for fires, drifted across the water. "There is something I must tell you," Ned said. "Something that changes what the trial meant and what comes next." Barristan looked at him. He did not speak. He waited, the disciplined patience of a man who had stood guard behind kings and heard secrets that would have toppled lesser men. Joffrey is not Robert's son. None of them are. Not Joffrey. Not Myrcella. Not Tommen. They are Jaime's children, born of Cersei and her twin brother. The succession is false. The throne belongs to Stannis. Barristan's face did not change. It locked, the muscles freezing in place, the eyes going flat and hard and still. The expression of a man who has just heard the ground beneath his life described as hollow. "You are certain. Jon Arryn died proving it. I proved it again. Robert's bastards, every one of them dark-haired, every one of them with his jaw and his build and his eyes. And Joffrey, golden-haired, green-eyed. Tommen the same. Myrcella the same. Not a drop of Baratheon blood in any of them. Cersei admitted it to me in the Godswood before I was arrested. She admitted it. She warned me to leave. She said she would deny it, and the word of a queen against the word of a hand would go the way of power. She was right. Robert died before I could tell him, and then the boy I was trying to remove from the throne had me arrested, and the truth went into the cells with me." Barristan turned back to the river. The current was brown and steady and carried the occasional branch or leaf southward toward the bay, and the old knight watched it with the expression of a man watching something that had once been solid dissolve into water. "I served Joffrey," Barristan said. "I called him Your Grace. I guarded his door and obeyed his commands, and would have died for him if the boy had the wit to keep me instead of dismissing me. You did your duty. I did my duty to a lie. I took an oath to protect the king, and the king was a boy who had no right to the title, and I protected him because I did not know. Because I did not look. Because looking would have meant questioning, and questioning would have meant the end of the certainty I needed to do my work." His voice was level. The self-accusation in it was worse than anger. It was the cold, surgical assessment of a man who held himself to standards that no human being could consistently meet, and who did not forgive the gap. "What do you intend to do?" Ned asked. Barristan looked at him. His blue eyes were clear and hard and carried the weight of 63 years of service and the sudden, disorienting lightness of a man whose chains had just been cut. "I intend to find the rightful king and serve him. Stannis Baratheon is Robert's heir. The throne is his by law. If he will have me, I will take his Kingsguard vow and keep it until I die. He will have you. Stannis is many things, but he is not a fool. The sword of Barristan Selmy is worth more than a fleet. I am not a sword, Lord Stark. I am a shield. The difference matters." They parted at the crossroads south of the Twins, Barristan riding east toward the coast, where he would find a ship at Maidenpool or Saltpans and sail to Dragonstone. Ned watched him go, the straight-backed figure on the grey horse, diminishing along the eastern road until the trees swallowed him and the road was empty. "Will we see him again?" Alan asked. "On a battlefield, if the gods are cruel. At a peace table, if they are kind." They rode on. The Twins appeared on the 7th day, the two castles straddling the Green Fork like a toll gate built by a man who had turned geography into revenue. Lord Walder Frey's seat was visible for miles across the flat riverland, its twin towers grey and squat against the sky, and the banner of the crossing, the blue towers on silver, hung limp in the windless air. But it was not the Frey's banner that made Ned pull his horse to a halt on the ridge above the eastern castle. It was the second banner, flying from a staff above the bridge, grey on white, a direwolf. Robb. The army was encamped on the eastern bank, a sprawl of tents and horse lines and cook fires that covered the fields south of the castle and stretched into the tree line. Ned estimated 2,000 men from the ridge, and when they rode closer the number grew, banners he recognized: the Umber Giant and the Karstark Sunburst and the Mormont Bear. Northern houses that had answered the call of a boy of 15 who was calling himself king in the north because his father was in a cell and his mother's family needed swords. They were not calling him king in the north. Not yet. That title had not been spoken. Not in this version of events. When Ned was alive and free and riding toward the camp with 3 carts of dead men and a broken leg and the truth of the succession in his mouth. The outriders found them a mile from the camp. Northern scouts, young men on shaggy garrons, their faces cold and watchful. Bolton men, by the look of them, pale and quiet. They took one look at Ned and rode ahead at a gallop, and by the time the procession reached the camp's perimeter, the entire army seemed to be on its feet. Ned heard his name ripple through the camp, like wind through grass. Stark, Stark, Lord Stark, it's Lord Stark. And the sound of it was the sound of something that had been wound tight for weeks, releasing at once. The tension of an army that had mustered and marched and waited and wondered whether the man they were fighting for was alive or dead, and whose answer had just ridden in on a bay horse with a splintered leg and a face that looked like it had been carved from the grey stone of Winterfell itself. Robb met him at the edge of the camp. The boy. The man. Ned corrected himself, because the person walking toward him through the crowd of soldiers was not the boy he had left in Winterfell, stood at the end of the track with his auburn hair and his tully eyes and his mother's jaw and a sword at his hip that he had not been wearing when Ned rode south. He wore a cloak of grey fur over boiled leather and mail, and his face was harder than it had been 3 months ago, the softness of youth burned away by the burden of command and the sleepless nights of a boy carrying his father's war. Grey Wind was at his side. The direwolf was enormous, bigger than Ned remembered, grey and yellow-eyed, its head at Robb's waist, and its body coiled with the tension of an animal that could sense the camp's emotional charge and was deciding whether it warranted violence. Ned dismounted. The process was ungainly. The straps, the stiff leg, the lurch and the catch, and the grunt of pain that he could not suppress. And Alan moved to help him, and Ned waved him off, because this was not a moment that allowed for assistance. He stood on the packed earth. He looked at his son. Robb crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and put his arms around his father and held him, and the embrace was fierce and graceless and complete, and Ned's broken legs screamed, and his cracked ribs protested, and his split lip reopened against Robb's shoulder, and none of it mattered, because his son was alive and armed and here, and the war had not yet taken him. "Father," Rob's voice was thick. His grip tightened. I know what you thought. The ravens said the trial. The ravens said you were free. But we didn't. I couldn't be sure. I am here, Rob." They separated. Rob wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a motion so quick and self-conscious that it would have been invisible to anyone standing more than 3 feet away, and straightened. And the commander's mask slid back into place over the boy's face, with the speed that told Ned the mask had been worn so often in recent weeks that it fit better than the face beneath it. "You're injured." "My leg is broken. The rest is bruises." "I will heal." "The maester, later. There are things I must tell you first." And they cannot wait. They went to Rob's tent, a northern war tent. Hide and canvas, smelling of horse and tallow, and the close staleness of a command space that had been occupied by anxious men for too many days. Maps covered the table. The Neck, the Twins, the King's Road South. Troop dispositions. Supply lines, the architecture of a war that Rob had been planning in the absence of the man the war was meant to rescue. Catelyn was there. She rose from the chair beside the table, and her face did the thing that faces do when the body's relief overwhelms the mind's discipline. It collapsed, rebuilt, collapsed again. She crossed the tent and took Ned's hands and held them, and her grip was stronger than Rob's had been, tighter, edged with the desperation of a woman who had been holding the family together from a distance, and whose hands were now shaking with the strain of it. "You're alive. I am alive. Sansa?" "Sansa is in King's Landing. She is a hostage. The terms of my release require her to remain." Kat's grip tightened, her jaw locked. Ned saw the calculations moving behind her eyes, a mother's arithmetic, weighing the child in hand against the child in the cage, the impossible math of a family broken across a continent. "We will get her back," Kat said. "Whatever it takes. Yes, but not by force. Not yet." Ned lowered himself into a chair, the pain of sitting almost worse than the pain of standing, because bending the knee joint moved the bone. "Close the tent. What I have to say is for the 3 of us, and no one else." Rob closed the tent flap. He posted a guard. He sat across from his father at the map table, and the grey light of the northern afternoon came through the canvas and gave the tent the quality of a space suspended between the world outside and the truth inside. Ned told them everything. He told them about Jon Arryn and the Book of Lineages. He told them about Robert's bastards, dark-haired, every one. He told them about Cersei's admission in the Godswood. He told them that Joffrey and Tommen and Myrcella were born of incest, that the throne they occupied was stolen, that the man with the lawful claim was Stannis Baratheon, grinding his teeth on Dragonstone and waiting for the moment to strike. He told them about the letter to Stannis. He told them about Barristan, where the old knight was riding and why. He told them about the trial, about the men who had died, about the cost of divine judgment when the gods spoke through steel. When he was finished, the tent was very still. Rob broke the silence. "You mean to support Stannis? Stannis is the rightful king. The law is the law. Stannis has never shown our family any warmth. He held Storm's End during the rebellion. He did his duty, nothing more. He sent no word to us about Cersei. He told Jon Arryn and let Jon Arryn die and said nothing. Stannis does not deal in warmth. He deals in duty, and duty, in a king, is worth more than warmth." Rob looked at the maps. His eyes moved across the rivers and the roads and the castles, and Ned could see the young man's mind working, the strategic recalculation that Ned's freedom demanded. The war they had been planning was a rescue mission. The war they now faced was a succession crisis, and the difference changed everything. "If we support Stannis, the Northern Lords will resist. They marched to bring you home. They did not march to put a Baratheon they've never met on the Iron Throne. Then you will need to convince them. You are their lord's son. They follow you. Make them understand that the alternative to Stannis is Joffrey, a bastard born of incest, backed by Tywin Lannister's gold and Tywin Lannister's army. The North cannot defeat Tywin alone. Stannis has a fleet and a claim. Together, They can break the Lannisters. Apart, they will be broken. Cat spoke. And Sansa? The name fell into the tent like a stone into water, and the ripples it produced touched every surface. Sansa is Cersei's leverage. As long as we march south, Sansa is in danger. As long as we hold the neck, Sansa is safe, because a dead hostage is no hostage at all. And Cersei is smart enough to know that killing Sansa would cost her the only check she has on 30,000 northern swords. You are gambling with your daughter's life. I am playing the only hand I was dealt. I did not choose the cards. I chose to stay alive long enough to play them. The silence after that was the silence of a family staring at the shape of a war and a sacrifice, and finding that the shape did not allow for comfort. Robb broke it by standing. I will speak to the lords. Great John Umber, Roose Bolton, Rickard Karstark. They need to hear this from me, not from a raven. From us, Ned said. I will stand beside you when you tell them. They need to see that this is not a boy's decision. It is a lord's. Robb looked at his father. The expression that crossed his face was complex. Gratitude tangled with pride, tangled with the faint, stubborn resistance of a young man who had been leading an army for 3 weeks and was not entirely ready to share the command. Together, then. Together. The realm that remains. The raven from Dragonstone reached every castle in the 7 kingdoms within a fortnight of the trial. Stannis Baratheon's declaration was written in his own hand, blunt, unadorned, stripped of the courtly language that his maesters would have used, and carrying instead the flat, grinding certainty of a man who stated facts the way other men swung swords. The letter named Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella as bastards born of the incestuous union between Cersei Lannister and her twin brother, Sir Jaime Lannister of the Kingsguard. It named Stannis as the rightful heir to the Iron Throne by virtue of being Robert Baratheon's eldest surviving trueborn brother. It called upon every lord of the 7 kingdoms to renounce the usurper and pledge fealty to the lawful king. And it referenced the trial. This was the stroke that Stannis had calculated, and Davos had questioned, and the timing had justified. The letter did not merely accuse. It pointed to the trial by 7 as divine corroboration. The gods had judged Eddard Stark innocent of the charges brought by Joffrey's crown. The gods had spoken through steel. The gods had declared, in the oldest and most binding form of judgment known to the faith, that the crown's case was false. And if the crown's case against Ned Stark was false, the letter asked, what else might the crown's claims be false about? The logic was devastating, because it was simple. A peasant could follow it. A lord could follow it. A septon could follow it and preach it from the steps of his village sept. And the septons did. Dozens of them, across the Crownlands and the Reach and the Stormlands, standing before their congregations and reading Stannis' letter aloud and asking the same question the letter asked. If the gods judged the crown's accusation false, what does that tell us about the crown? The High Septon, who had presided over the trial and declared the verdict, said nothing. He retreated into the Great Sept and closed its doors and spent 3 days in prayer, and when he emerged his statement was a masterpiece of theological neutrality. The gods had judged the trial. The trial's verdict was absolute, and the faith took no position on the political implications of divine judgment. It was a statement that satisfied no one and offended everyone, which meant it was exactly what the High Septon intended. Because a faith that chose sides in a succession crisis was a faith that would be destroyed by whichever side it chose against. But the trial had changed the faith's position, regardless of what the High Septon said. The institution that had presided over the trial was now the institution whose authority confirmed, however indirectly, that Stannis' claims might be true. Lords who wanted to support Stannis could point to the trial as evidence. Lords who wanted to oppose him could not dismiss the trial without dismissing the faith. The ground had shifted. And the faith stood on higher ground than it had occupied in decades, and the most devout knew it, and their calculations about the future of the 7 kingdoms were now informed by a power they had not possessed before the trial was called. On Dragonstone, Stannis received Barristan's Selmy in his study on a morning of cold rain and salt wind. The meeting was brief. Stannis was not a man who conducted audiences with ceremony or decoration, and Barristan was not a man who required them. The old knight walked into the stone room and stood before the table where the maps were spread and the candles burned low in the grey light, and he said what he had come to say. "Your Grace, I served your brother for 15 years. I was dismissed from his son's Kingsguard, wrongly, as events have shown, since the boy is not his son. I have been told the truth of the succession by Lord Eddard Stark, whom the gods have judged innocent, and whose word I believe. I offer you my sword." Stannis looked at him. The king's face was hard and angular and carried the rigid quality of a man who trusted nothing he had not verified himself, and who verified things by grinding them against his expectations until they either matched or broke. "You served Joffrey. I served the crown. I did not know the crown was false. Ignorance is a poor shield for a man of the Kingsguard. It is. I do not offer it as a shield, I offer it as an explanation. I was wrong. I am here to be right." Stannis ground his jaw. The sound was audible in the stone room, the creak of bone against bone, the habitual motion that expressed the constant, restless tension of a man who processed the world through pressure rather than speech. "You are the finest swordsman the Seven Kingdoms." "I was. I am 63. You cut down the Hound in single combat 4 days ago. The Hound is not the Seven Kingdoms. He is closer to it than most, and you stood against 7 of the Kingsguard, men you trained, men you commanded, and you won. I stood with 6 others. 3 of them died. The victory was not mine alone." Stannis stared at him for a long time. Then he nodded, once, the way Stannis Baratheon acknowledged anything, with the minimum motion necessary to communicate consent. "Lord Commander of my Kingsguard, the position is yours. Do not make me regret it. I will not, Your Grace." Davos Seaworth, who had been standing at the door throughout the exchange, let out a breath he had been holding since Barristan walked in. The Onion Knight had seen many meetings in Stannis' study, and most of them had ended with the visitor wishing he had stayed home. This one had ended with something rarer, a king and a knight arriving at the same conclusion by different roads and finding that the roads met. In the Reach, Renly Baratheon read his brother's declaration at Highgarden, in the chambers that the Tyrells had given him. Spacious, beautiful, overlooking the rose gardens that gave the castle its name. Margaery Tyrell sat beside him, her brown eyes watchful, her lips slightly parted, her beauty a weapon she wielded with the same precision that her grandmother, Olenna, wielded words. Renly set the letter down. Well, that complicates things. He had been planning his own declaration. The groundwork was laid, the Tyrell alliance, the Stormlands bannerman, the tournament circuit of charm and generosity that had made him the most popular Baratheon in the Seven Kingdoms, and the one that most people, if asked, would have preferred as king. His claim was weaker than Stannis's by law, but law was a flexible instrument when applied by the right hands. And Renly's hands were very right indeed. But the trial changed the arithmetic. Before the trial, Renly could have declared and dismissed Stannis as the Dow middle brother, whose claim was technically superior, but practically irrelevant. A man with a small army, and no allies, and no charm, and no ability to attract the kind of following that a king required. After the trial, Stannis had the most famous knight in the realm, the endorsement of a lord who had been judged innocent by the gods, and a letter that every Septon in the Seven Kingdoms was reading aloud from their steps. Renly could still declare. His army was larger than Stannis's, his alliances were stronger, his support in the Reach was absolute. And the Reach was the richest and most populous kingdom. But declaring now meant dividing the opposition to Joffrey at the moment when unity might have broken the Lannisters entirely, and the lords of the realm, even those who preferred Renly, would see the division and draw their own conclusions about a man who put ambition above the cause. "What do we do?" Margaery asked. Renly picked up a rose from the bowl on the table. He turned it in his fingers, examining the petals, his handsome face thoughtful and unclouded, and carrying the serene confidence of a man who had not yet been forced to choose between what he wanted and what was possible. "We wait," he said. "We watch. And we see whether Stannis can do what Stannis has never done in his life, inspire men to follow him. If he can, we have a king. If he cannot, we have an opportunity. He put the rose down. The petals were undamaged. Renly Baratheon had always been gentle with beautiful things, especially when he was deciding whether to use them. At his field camp in the Riverlands, Tywin Lannister received the news of Ned Stark's freedom and Stannis Baratheon's declaration on the same day, delivered by two ravens that arrived within the hour of each other. He read both messages in his tent, at the campaign table where his maps were spread and his wine was poured, and his face reflected none of the fury that a lesser man would have shown. Tywin Lannister did not express fury. Fury was a resource, like gold or soldiers, and he spent it only when the expenditure produced a return. The trial was a mistake, he said. His voice was even. Cersei should have had the man confess and take the black. A trial gives the accused a stage, and Eddard Stark used it. Kevan sat across the table. His brother's face was the face that Kevan had known for 40 years, controlled, analytical, stripped of everything that did not serve the immediate problem. The immediate problem was that the family's position had deteriorated from strong to complicated in the space of a single combat that lasted 11 minutes. Stannis will declare war, Tywin said. He has a fleet, Selmy, and the moral authority of the trial's verdict. Ned Stark has the North and the Riverlands. Together, they can field 50,000 men and 100 ships. Apart, neither is a threat. Together, they are. Then we ensure they do not come together. That is the strategy. The execution requires speed. We need to take Riverrun before Stark and Tully can consolidate, cut the Riverlands in half, and deny Stannis a land route to the north. If Stark and Stannis cannot link their forces, they cannot bring their combined strength to bear, and we can defeat them in detail. Tywin stood. He walked to the tent's entrance and looked out at the army. The same army, the same fires, the same lion banner. The efficiency still pleased him. The order still pleased him. What had changed was the scope of the war he was planning, which had expanded from a police action against a rebellious lord to a multi-front conflict against two legitimate claimants and a veteran commander who had once held the Kingsguard together. Write to Cersei. Tell her that Sansa Stark is not to be harmed. The girl is worth more alive than every gold dragon in Casterly Rock. And if Joffrey's impulses damage her, I will hold Cersei responsible. Kevan wrote the letter. The Raven went south, carrying instructions from a man who understood leverage better than any lord in the Seven Kingdoms, and who knew that the most powerful weapon in a war was not a sword or a dragon or a fleet. It was a hostage whose father loved her. In King's Landing, Sansa Stark sat in the maiden vault and embroidered a direwolf on a handkerchief. The room was warm. The afternoon light came through the window in a slant that caught the dust motes and turned them to gold, and the scepter who guarded her dozed in a chair by the door, and the sounds of the Red Keep, servants' footsteps. The distant clang of the armory, a gull's cry from the waterfront, drifted in and out of her awareness like waves on a shore she could not reach. She was not allowed to leave. She had been told that she was a guest, and the word guest had a meaning in King's Landing that was different from its meaning in Winterfell. And the difference was a locked door and a guard who did not meet her eyes, and the growing certainty that the world she had been promised, the world of songs and knights and princes, was a story told to girls so that they would go south without fighting. Her father was free. Her father had ridden north. Her father had left her here. She did not blame him. She was 11, but she was not stupid, and she had heard enough through doors and seen enough through windows to understand that her father's freedom had been purchased at the cost of her captivity, and that the purchase was the only option that did not end with both of them dead. Leverage was not a mystery to her, nor were hostages. She was the chain that bound Ned Stark's hands even as his feet carried him toward Winterfell. She saw all of this with a clarity that no 11-year-old should possess, and it did not make the loneliness smaller. The direwolf took shape beneath her needle, grey thread on white linen, the running wolf of House Stark. She worked with the precision that her mother had taught her and a patience that her scepter in Winterfell had drilled into her. And each stitch was a word in a language that she could not speak aloud. I am here. I am Stark. I am not what they say I am. I am waiting. I will wait. She finished the embroidery as the sun went down. She held it up to the fading light and examined it, the grey wolf, mid-stride, its head raised, its mouth open in a howl that the cloth could not produce. It was good work. Her mother would have approved. Sansa folded the handkerchief and placed it under her pillow and lay down and closed her eyes and did not sleep, because sleep required the kind of safety that Sansa Stark had not felt since the day the king died, and the world that had promised her everything delivered her into a cage. In the north, at the Twins, in the war tent that smelled of horse and iron, and the charged tension of men who have been told that their cause has changed shape, Ned Stark stood beside his son and looked at the map of the 7 kingdoms and saw the truth. The realm was cracked. The trial had not healed it. The trial had shown the cracks to every eye in the 7 kingdoms, and the showing had made them wider. Stannis would come from the east with ships and justice. Renly might come from the south with flowers and ambition. Tywin would come from the west with gold and calculation. And in the center of it all, a boy with no right to the throne sat on a chair of swords and gave orders that grown men obeyed, because the alternative was admitting that they had been kneeling to a lie. Ned's leg ached. His ribs throbbed. His lip was healing into a scar that would mark his face until the day he died. The pain was familiar now, not comfortable, not welcome, but present in the way that a companion is present, steady and unignorable and constant. 3 men had died for him. Their bodies were in the lickyard at the Twins, awaiting transport, Glendon to Winterfell, Marlon to White Harbour, Clement to the Sept. Their names would be remembered. Ned had sworn it, and Ned Stark kept his oaths, but the oaths ahead were harder than the oaths behind. He looked at the map. The King's Road ran south like a scar across the continent, from Winterfell to King's Landing, through forests and rivers and marshes and 1,000 miles of country that would soon be soaked in blood. His daughter was at one end, his sons were at the other, and the space between them was filling with armies and ravens and the gathering storm of a war that would determine whether the truth he had spoken and the truth the gods had judged and the truth that Stannis was putting to paper would be enough to break a dynasty of lions, or whether the lions would break them first. Robb was beside him, 15 years old, armoured, armed, commanding 2,000 men with the authority of a lord's son and the instincts of a boy who had been handed too much too soon and had not yet broken under the weight. Grey wind pressed against his leg, and the direwolf's amber eyes reflected the candlelight, and the beast was still and watchful and ready. "The Blackfish has reached Seaguard," Robb said. He sent word from the port. "The letter to Stannis is on a ship. The letter to you is in my hand." He paused. "Stannis's reply will come within the fortnight, if the winds hold." "Good. What do we do until then?" "We hold the Twins. We guard the crossing. We send ravens to every lord who has not yet chosen a side, and we tell them the truth. And we let them decide. And if they decide against us," Ned looked at his son. The candlelight caught the boy's face. Young, hard, afraid, determined, all of it tangled together in the expression of a person standing at the edge of something vast and irreversible. "Then we fight them too. But the truth is a better ally than any army, Robb. The truth is what men follow when the lies run out. And the lies are running out." The candle guttered. The tent shifted in a wind that had come down from the north, carrying the cold edge of the season that was coming. Not winter, not yet, but the promise of it. The advance guard of a darkness that would test every alliance and every oath, and every man who had chosen a side in the war that the gods had judged and the realm had not yet finished fighting. Ned Stark stood in the tent with his son and his maps and his broken leg and the names of 3 dead men in his heart, and he looked south, toward King's Landing, toward the throne, toward the daughter he had left behind. And the look on his face was the look of a man who had been given his freedom and had paid for it with something he could not replace, and who intended to spend the rest of his life earning it back. Outside, the river ran beneath the bridge. The northern camp stirred with the sounds of men preparing, sharpening blades, mending mail, speaking in low voices about the war ahead. Grey Wind raised his head and turned his yellow eyes toward the darkness beyond the firelight, and his ears pricked forward, and a sound came from his throat. Not a growl and not a howl, but something between. A sound that carried across the camp and made the horses shift and the sentries grip their spears, and the night itself seemed to pull back, as if the darkness had heard the wolf and decided to give it room. The realm that remained was a realm at war. The truth was spoken. The gods had judged. The lions were in the west, and the stags were in the east, and the wolves were in the north, and the girl was in the cage, and the old knight was on the sea, and the war was coming. It had already begun.